Ooh, this is gonna make people mad. A little while back, I made a video analyzing my favorite part of Bleach. In it, I expressed distaste for the last half of the series and lamented, "Oh, it's never as good as it is here." I thought this was so obvious that I didn't need to clarify or justify myself further. A bunch of people promptly disagreed. To be entirely fair, they were incredibly polite and earnestly defended the last couple of arcs, and I really enjoyed reading what people had to say. Comment sections on YouTube can be an absolute cesspit, especially when they disagree with you, but people were so sincerely kind to my last video that it was just a genuine pleasure reading what people had to say. I really loved being able to engage with all of you about my favorite manga. So, thank you. But setting that pleasant surprise aside, I was confused. To my recollection, the second half of Bleach was so boring and infuriating that no one could possibly enjoy them. The fact that so many people disagreed with me, well, it made me doubt. I read this part years ago, after all, and the last 100 or so chapters were a frantic mad dash ages after the fact, and I recognized that, when you've been reading Bleach for 6 hours and it's 2 in the morning and you just want to be done, you're probably not gonna like things too much. It is entirely possible that things weren't exactly as I recalled. So I climbed off my high horse and I went back to the text. I read it again, met everything on its own terms, engaged with it critically and authentically, saw what Bleach wanted me to see. If you're waiting for a come to Kubo moment where I see the error of my ways and say this is the best part of Bleach actually, that didn't happen. All of the criticisms I had before still stand. The pacing is messy, the characters are less consistent, and Kubo blatantly drops or changes certain long-standing themes, seemingly for no reason. But that isn't to say the last couple of arcs are bad. Bleach on its worst day is still really good. A fun, engaging story with gorgeous art and hidden depths. But I don't think they're as good as what came before, or at the very least, don't suit my tastes as well. I would give these last few arcs a solid 6.8 to 7.5. Still good, would recommend, but not quite the 9s and 10s I've been used to. Which has me asking my next question. Why didn't it click for me? What part left me cold? What wasn't hitting the mark the way it used to? Which is a lot more complicated to explain. This video is a companion to my previous one, though it will be different in substance and intent. This will be less of a thematic or character-driven analysis, and more of a technical one, focusing on the actual storycraft of each arc. I want to break down how Kubo was telling these stories, focus on the gritty technical details, and discuss where things do and do not work. This is hardly an authoritative guide. If you disagree with me, that's totally fine. I know a lot of people genuinely love these arcs, and I am truly happy that is the case. The goal of this video isn't so much to convince you that I'm right or to dunk on a story because rage gets more clicks on the internet, but rather engage with it authentically and figure out why I feel the way I do. If that interests you, awesome. If you don't want to hear someone deeply criticizing your favorite story for about 2.5 hours, also awesome. If you do want to hear someone deeply criticize your favorite story so you can write a thesis about how I'm wrong, Bleach has no flaws, I need you to know that the passionate multi-paragraph comments will not change my mind, but I will still enjoy reading them. Thank you for your time and for your engagement. I'm also going to assume that you've read all of Bleach, 1000-Year Blood War anime only fans, there be spoilers. I usually strive to make my essays as accessible as possible for newcomers and old hands both, but there's just too much ground to cover, and this is already twice as long as intended. There will be some stage setting, but if I randomly mention a thing that happened with absolutely zero context, the context is 686 chapters of source material. I genuinely cannot help you more than that. I'd still love it if you stayed. I also want to point out that I am largely using the official Jump translation for this essay. I figured that it would be most easily accessible and the version that most English speakers would be familiar with, but I also noticed that it can vary pretty intensely from fan translations. Typically, it's small details like spellings or vocabulary, but it can be as serious as changing character motivations or complicating plot explanations. Normally, I wouldn't address this in the essay itself because it's a fiddly thing most people probably wouldn't notice or even care about one way or another, but since this essay is focusing so intensely on how Kubo tells the story and his success at doing so, I want to acknowledge this as a complicating factor. Some of my frustration or confusion might actually be due to a translation error rather than a failing on Kubo's part. I've done my best to bridge those differences in the essay and will have on-screen text acknowledging them as they apply, but be advised that this is a factor throughout. Fake Karakura Town. This is, admittedly, a strange place to begin an analysis of the second half of Bleach. But I think of Fake Karakura Town as a vital prelude to understanding what happens next. Fake Karakura Town is the culmination of everything in Bleach up to this point. This is the last stand of the Soul Society, the all-out confrontation that determines whether our heroes are able to stop Aizen in his tracks, or if Aizen achieves deification. Friendship, ideologies, and even identities are tested as both sides fight for power and ultimately determine who attains control. In many ways, Fake Karakura isn't so much about Ichigo as it is the Shinigami. It's gratifying to see these people be fleshed out, paying off the suggestions of character we've had so far. We get to see more of their internal philosophy, as with Kira and Tasagi offering a mellow counterbalance to the more bombastic Shinigami we've come to know. And we also get a sense of what Hueco Mundo was like before Aizen did his cheeky little bit of colonialism. In showing what people are fighting for, Kubo fills out aspects of the world we previously might not have considered. Reading through it again helped me realize the storylines are far more profound now that I have another decade's worth of experience under my belt. This arc is full of setups and payoffs for characters outside of the main set, and I appreciate that not only does Kubo take the time to validate the absurdly large cast, but also have most of their storylines contributing and directly commenting on the greater themes of the story. I enjoyed getting to see the depth of sillier or more jokey characters like Yumichika and Shunsui. I liked seeing how some characters used their wits instead of brute force like Shinji and Soifon, and I just like the stand up and cheer moments when someone like Don Kananji shows up out of the blue. That's cool, that's fun, I like this. Fake Karakura is working very hard to weave in all of the disparate threads from the 3 previous arcs, answering as many questions as possible, as well as wrapping up the greater macro arc of Aizen being a menace. We've had our Dark Night of the Soul, and now we get to deliver on our convictions. And, of course, many of Bleach's subtler themes are developed via the classic Bleach format. Fight a guy, learn something integral, move on. Fight a guy, learn something integral, move on. Over a series of battles, Kubo points out the complicated nature of the Gote 13, the cost of solving everything through bloodshed, the way hegemonies can be exploited to allow atrocities to occur, and how relying on a 15-year-old to save the world is all fun and games until it costs him the very thing he values most. This is a war, and Kubo needs you to understand that it is not fun or glamorous. It is desperate and bloody and cruel, the apt conclusion of a long, hard-earned journey. And after saying all of that, I have a confession to make. I kind of hate Fake Karakura Town. There are plenty of reasons why I dislike it, the most petty being that it's sandwiched around my absolute favorite chapters of Bleach that are just demonstrably different in intention and tone. The Lust chapters are different from most of Bleach, if we're being honest, and I legitimately spent the rest of the story trying to chase that high, and just not getting it. Which isn't a problem, but if you're looking for existential, horror-laced misery, this ain't it. This ain't it. That is not happening. That said, Fake Karakura Town is just narratively weaker than the arcs that came before. The structure feels less considered given its more ambitious scope. The fact that we start by leaving Ichigo on a cliffhanger with Okuyoda, going over to the Shinigami in Fake Karakura for a while, and then going back to Ichigo means our attention is weirdly split, which isn't a good way to start a story. I know that I'm kind of granular in my viewing of this middle chunk of the story, in that I separate the Arrancar arc, the Hueco arc, and Fate Karakura Town out from each other. But the reason I feel comfortable doing so is that they have different arcs and intentions. Hueco is not about the same things that Fake Karakura Town is. And so, by weirdly segmenting Ichigo's conflict with Ulquiorra between Hueco and Fate Karakura Town, Ichigo's conflict with Ulquiorra is weirdly segmented, giving us a cliffhanger before the most important part. Which means that Hueco lacks a strong narrative conclusion, but also interrupts the building tension of the Shinigami, pulling us from the far more developed and long-standing conflict with Ulquiorra, only to spike us back from one of the most intense sequences for Stark and Shunsui playing Chasey Chase for about 4 chapters. It's not fun. I'm not having fun. I wasn't having fun before, but I liked not having fun. I want to see Ichigo die again. Even ignoring that, in an ironic twist, I think the classic Bleach format sabotages the pacing here. Fake Karakura Town is described as a war, and when I think a war, I'm imagining chaos, mass destruction, confusion, constantly shifting terrain, power dynamics pushing and pulling. Not a series of disconnected duels taking place in the sky where people monologue and neatly explain the terms and conditions of their powers to each other. Don't get me wrong, I like how battles work in Bleach. I enjoy the 3-beat structure where Kubo introduces personal stakes and peril with every power-up or development. It's like watching the duel in Princess Bride. I'm living for the banter, the showboating, the back and forth of ideas and beliefs. It's awesome in its lack of realism, even when it's really harrowing.
There's something I ought to tell you. Tell me. I'm not left-handed either.
But if you were to tell me that there were 8 of these duels happening at once and they're fighting for the sake of the world, and one side is supposed to be this formidable, terrifying army like the world has never seen, only to have them systematically be taken out one at a time by a bunch of side characters I don't know super well, you can see how I would have some complaints. It doesn't help that the thing I praised this arc for earlier, focusing on the side characters, overstays its welcome. Kubo is very talented in making you invested in random side characters over the course of a few chapters. But it's a special kind of frustrating to be waiting for the guys that I do have several years and hundreds of chapters of investment in, just biting my nails seeing when Renji will come back, for example, and instead being told, no, consider this joke character. He's very deep, actually, because look at this whole speech he gave, and he's very interesting, and I need you to care about him and his weapon and the person he's fighting, whom you also don't know, and Kubo has to backfill a lot to give you enough context to give a crap, and maybe he doesn't. Maybe this person is also a joke character, and you just have to sit by and watch these 2 randos punch each other real good, and then it's done, and you realize, I don't think these people matter at all, actually. I don't think they learned anything, and I don't think they grew. This person was just an obstacle to clear in order to get to the fight with Aizen, and oh look, you have 5 more to go. That's not to say every battle is pointless. I meant all of the praise I said earlier, and several of these fights do develop larger themes. It feels good watching Shinji fight Aizen, even if he doesn't win. It feels impactful when Komamura comes face to face with Kaname. These are catharsis, payoff for things that have come before. But honestly, I think only 3 or maybe 4 of these fights actually make sense for us to watch. Otherwise, a lot of it feels like padding, twiddling our thumbs until Ichigo can show up and do his thing. The second half of the arc is better at this, because most of the weaker people have been incapacitated in some way, but the problem still remains. We spend seemingly endless chapters where people throw themselves at Aizen and he goes, "You poor pathetic fool. Did you think I wouldn't prepare for this?" Only with more words. And then he takes them out, and then there's some talking, maybe a snippet of someone doing something across the way, and then another person throws themselves at Aizen, and he goes, "You poor pathetic little fool." But this time with even more words, and I want to gouge out my eyes. Yes, we get it. You're very smart and powerful and cunning and ruthless, and it's impossible to beat you. I find the Aizen sections frustrating because so much of it feels like a waste of time. No matter who he fights, no matter what trick they have up their sleeve, no matter what team up or secret move or special ability these people pull, he always slaps down an Uno reverse and says, "Actually, I'm totally fine." Which I will admit is pretty impactful the first time you do it. It's effective even the second. But when it's fight after fight after fight of Aizen weaseling out of everything, negating any attempts at progress while constantly bragging that he's better than everyone else, and without people learning anything or gaining any sense of growth, my patience starts to wear thin. I understand the narrative function of these fights. We're stalling until Ichigo can arrive, giving context for Aizen's power, and building up to the final conflict between the two. And you know, there are some pretty impactful moments sprinkled along the way. Seeing the forces of the Soul Society step forward and declare that they will keep Ichigo safe made me want to cry like a little baby. Someone protect this boy. He is not doing well. I also appreciate how Kubo organically seeds in ideas, as with establishing that Ichigo is the only person that can fight Aizen. Having Isshin realize that people too weak to fight Aizen simply can't feel his spiritual pressure, then later having Ichigo express fear because he can feel Aizen's power and doesn't think he can match him, and then topping that off with Aizen not being able to feel Ichigo's spiritual pressure, that's good. That's good subtle storytelling. I want to put these pages on my wall. But then there are also entire chapters of Aizen aimlessly wandering around, playing peekaboo with a bunch of teenagers while bragging that he could destroy them whenever he wanted. He could do it anytime. He could just wipe the whole world away. Any second now, he could crush them like bugs. Just trust him. He's very powerful and important, and everything he does has a point. And if that just doesn't make you want to put your head through a window, I don't know what will. Kubo has backed himself into this weird corner where there isn't really anything stopping Aizen from achieving his goal until the very last second. But he takes so long screwing around that his enemies have time to defeat him in the very last second. If Aizen is half so ruthless, clever, and paranoid as the story has made him seem up to this point, he would have won and the story would be over halfway through. If you have to make up reasons for why he just chooses to randomly not follow through on his goals, if you have to introduce a complication in one chapter and then resolve it in the next, just to hurriedly pay off character arcs or pad for time, you've probably not executed that idea very well. And yes, I am talking about Gin. This is specifically a Gin call-out post. I would have liked any development of Gin's thoughts and intentions before this moment, because then I would actually make his betrayal important and impactful, but instead we just have Matsumoto running around telling us it's important. I'm going to die! It makes Aizen a weaker character. It pulls me out of the story when I should be the most invested, and it makes me start to notice that, wait a second, if Aizen was supposed to be terrible, ruthless, pragmatic, and bad, why is basically everyone who fought him still alive? There is a shocking amount of plot armor going on in Fate Karakura Town that only gets worse throughout the story. Now look, I'm not above a little plot armor here or there, okay? Ichigo should be reasonably dead 10 times over. Most of the characters in Bleach should be dead 10 times over. But there's something that feels especially bad when Kubo says out loud, all caps, "These characters should not fight Aizen and survive." And then they do that. Several times. Urahara, Yoruichi, Isshin, Hitsugaya, Momo, Shinsui, Yamamoto, Hiyori, and even arguably Shinji should be dead in the ground right now. There is a panel that really makes it look like everyone opposing Aizen is dead, and that affected me. That was really bad. I understood how severe things were. And then they get back up, but this time with little hatch marks on their faces, so you know that they're real beat up and bloody. There is no justification for why Aizen would not slaughter the Shinigami. Full stop. I would accept this if it were his tragic flaw, but it's not set up to be that. Nothing comes from it. There's no commentary on it. There's no acknowledgement that he screwed around and let the good guys beat him. It just looks like an oversight on his part or a contrivance on Kubo's, and it's lame. As for Ichigo, I'm of two minds. As a continuation of the last chapters, I really enjoy how becoming a Vastalordes rattled him. When you have a super powerful, physically unbeatable protagonist, you have to either depower them or present them with a problem that they cannot punch through. Ichigo can't punch through his fear of turning into a monster. He can't punch through the guilt and shame of losing control. There are points where he could have fast-tracked us to the ending, except he was held back by his own insecurities and doubt, and I liked that. I like seeing effort in my stories. I like seeing people fight to win, which is why I'm let down by the conclusion of this arc. There are several things building to this, but just to start us off, I don't like Ichigo's interaction with Zangetsu. No, I will not be calling him anything else in this video. And Shirasaki. No, I will not be calling him white. Full stop, I just don't like it. I find it too brief, too vague, and unfulfilling considering everything that just came before. It's functional, I don't think it's objectively bad, but it's just not doing what I need it to do. To me, the biggest question hanging over the story right now is, why did Ichigo turn into a monster? Yes, I know that Shirasaki told Ichigo that he would turn into a monster if he died before finding harmony. I'm not bitter that many people told me that in the comments of my last video. But I want to know one layer down from that. Why? Why is that the rule? Why did that happen? It's very different from everything else that happened. Please, Kubo, give me answers now. The whole Arrancar arc was about Ichigo learning to gain control of his hollow powers and, as I discussed in my previous video, being able to control his lust for battle. Ichigo is flirting with a corruption arc. Set aside your pretty ideals and your chocolate sweetness because you are fighting monsters. And it's an idea that a lot of fake Karakura Town deals with, expressed most blatantly by Shunsui. The moment you go to war, you are now evil. So because of that theming, I was led to believe that Ichigo became a monster because he failed his corruption arc. That is the thing. The darkness took over his soul. He now has to deal with that. And then Zangetsu tells me no, actually. Ichigo is having trouble not because of the corruption arc, but because he's been afraid of his power all along. This upsets me. This makes me mad. I didn't like saying that out loud. So anyone that has watched my previous video will know that I made my bones on the first half of this story being about corruption. And predictably, it would be a little upsetting to hear that I've interpreted it completely wrong. So I will do my due diligence and acknowledge that, yes, there is absolutely a case to make for Ichigo's failings stemming from his fear. His fear of being taken over by Shirasaki does make him falter in the beginning of the Arrancar arc, and it also makes him overly cautious when he escapes Huecomundo and attacks Aizen. There are repeated instances of people recognizing Ichigo's, we'll say, hesitancy or reluctance to do or interact with something, and they attribute it to his fear. Got it. But fear isn't the root of Ichigo's ills. Again, this is subjective interpretation, and I'm not really trying to argue about Kubo's authorial intent. If he's going to tell me that that is what he wants the story to mean, sure, that's what he wants the story to mean. I'm not trying to say who is more correct here. I'm not pulling this out of nowhere. There is a decent basis for me thinking Kubo meant this one thing over here and was confused when he said, actually, I meant this one thing over there. Something that will come up again in the story is that several things about Ichigo's inner world do not fly with me because they mash against this interpretation. So with all of that said, I do not think fear of your own power is a core theme of Bleach. If anything, Ichigo has been far too fearless, playing it fast and loose with what he can and cannot do because he doesn't know better. This is the kid that learned how to do a Bankai, rocked up to the hegemony 30 minutes later, and didn't even realize that his bones were giving way beneath his own strength. This is the kid that, with very rare exceptions, jumps feet first into every single conflict he can, who is ready to throw down and wrestle his way to victory every single time. Yes, Ichigo's deepest doubts arise when he is plagued by fear, and it is a hesitation that will get him killed, but this is also a justifiable response in the narrative itself. When Ichigo dives too deep into his power, and at this moment in time it is specifically his hollow power, he quite literally loses himself, becoming someone that will slaughter their way to victory, even if it violates his principles, and even if he must murder his friends. Ichigo experiences fear, absolutely, and it informs a large part of his character, specifically in these two arcs. But I think it's absolutely wrong to say that what he did was because he was afraid, and not he is afraid because of what he did. When Ichigo hesitates attacking Aizen, when he feels like his mask is so heavy he could fall to the ground, that reads as a 15-year-old being afraid of having turned into a nightmarish murder monster and almost having destroyed one of his closest friends. I don't think we should be shaking our finger at Ichigo Kurosaki because how dare this dumb little boy be scared of himself. There is a story to be told about Ichigo holding himself back because of fear, and it's one that I would really enjoy reading. but it's also not the story that we've been told up until this point. And so twisting it, literally inverting the cause and effect here, is frustrating, confusing, and it just feels wrong. Again, I don't want to speak to Kubo's authorial intent. Maybe this is what he wanted to write the entire time, and I'm just misunderstanding what he's saying. But I feel valid in my interpretation, and I think this is something that Kubo brought up much closer to the reveal than the beginning of the series, if that makes sense. This is something that I will explain in much more detail in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc section, but this is the prologue, this is the messy foundation. We're gonna go from here. Moving on from that, the actual ending of the arc it's not bad, but it's also not very well chosen. This arc isn't about Ichigo, not until the last quarter, it's about the Shinigami. And so it just feels a little misplaced that all of the narrative weight is suddenly about Ichigo again. He is the one that we are told is having the conclusion of his arc, while everyone else is left to the side. Aizen just isn't a good antagonist for Ichigo. Although he is the architect of Ichigo's suffering, there isn't any personal investment there. Ichigo is an unintended consequence of greater machinations, an opportunity and anomaly that caught Aizen's attention, but never specifically mattered to him. Similarly, Ichigo doesn't care about Aizen, he cares about the danger he poses to the things Ichigo cares about. When compared to Ichigo's more personal antagonists and foils like Grimmjow, Ulquiorra, Byakuya, and Renji, the substance is notably lacking. Ichigo and Aizen are strangers that only fight because of circumstance, and that's kind of disappointing after hundreds of chapters of build-up. Personally, I would have preferred it if someone like Shinji had the final blow, or perhaps it truly was a team effort to take him down, and that is the point of the arc, but alas. Not to mention, the absurd increase in powers means that the final confrontation is strangely weightless, as the scope is too vast to adequately comprehend. Kubo is using visual language to convey that these are world-ending attacks, but when they don't land or seemingly have no personal consequences, they might as well have not been made at all. The final confrontation isn't without its merits. Aizen finally attains a truly upsetting form after a whole slew of boring or even silly-looking ones. That's his skin! And we see yet again that absolute power is not a desirable state of being. This is the strongest idea that the arc presents, although it is quite subtle. Bleach looks you in the eye and says you do not want to be singular in your strength. Look at Stark. Look at Aizen. Look at Ichigo. Being on top means being alone, and that is an unbearably miserable way to live. I like that Kubo has Ichigo ruminate on it, staring at the skyline, reflecting on his choices. There is a somber melancholy here that I really appreciate. And then it's followed up with Ichigo saying that maybe Aizen didn't want to be all-powerful. Maybe that level of singularity made him feel lonely. Maybe, just maybe, the Hogyoku granted his secret wish of being just like everyone else. That has stunning implications coming from the mouth of one Ichigo Kurosaki, the boy that gained power to protect the people he loved, the boy that so hates his own helplessness that his pain changes the very weather around him, the boy that did everything to the point of becoming a terrifying monster to protect the ones he loves, to, as he says, shatter fate. For as poorly matched as Ichigo and Aizen are, there is true beauty in the parallels between them. Ichigo is a boy that attained ultimate power with the understanding that he was throwing all of it away, that it would not matter, that he would be reduced to nothing. Juxtaposed against Aizen, the man that viciously amassed power in order to elevate himself to the status of a god, to prove to everyone that he was as superb and supreme and exquisite as he always believed. And then Kubo has both of them look on the precipice of absolute power and seem to despair. It is an absolutely beautiful, tragic, and profound idea, and a shockingly subversive one in a battle manga. This is also the last time Bleach ever really talks about it, and I think that's incredibly sad. The more I think about and look into fake karakura, the more I see the bones of something that could have been a profound, somber conclusion to a story that has steadily grown darker with each week. It plays with a lot of very interesting ideas and has plenty of gratifying moments for people who have been reading along from the beginning. I know that. But that's still just the bones. The pacing is inconsistent, it raises quite a few questions that it can't reasonably answer, it lacks the immensely personal stakes that I've come to expect, and as we're going to see, it fails to resolve several very important themes and plot lines that I would have said were vital to the story. It also has the not insignificant difficulty of starting as a story about the Shinigami, and then pivoting in the last quarter to be a story about Ichigo, which is fine in its way, but also means that we don't get the build-up of one story or the conclusion of another. We just get two disparate sets of bones. In all, when I look at these issues, a part of me wonders if Kubo wasn't just trying to wrap things up, finish Bleach so he could finally take a break. Most of the pressing narrative threads are resolved, and it's a reasonable, if incredibly sad, conclusion. And Kubo himself has said that there was a time when he thought he was going to end Bleach much, much sooner than he actually did. If you told me this was the spot, that would make sense as much as anything else. And honestly, that's one of the things that's complicating my view on this arc. On one hand, it's the end of an era, rounding out the mega arc of Aizen. But on the other, it's kind of terrible at setting up the story for the next arc, severing the connective tissue so that the following two arcs are largely disconnected from all but a few events. That is just not a good narrative decision for such an intensely long-form serial story. But at the same time, this is still the end of an era. It is still resolving things, it's still bringing an entire narrative to a reasonable and competent conclusion, one that does, on several levels, feel satisfying, and I think that deserves praise. Final verdict? Kubo was probably getting burned out of 10. Fullbringer. 17 months have passed since Ichigo defeated Aizen, and we now get to see how he adjusts to his life as a normal person. The characters are older now, 17-year-olds with jobs, larger social networks, different reputations. It's fun seeing everyone grow up, just a bit. And it's also incredibly sad. Kubo described this arc as a soft reset, and the first chapter of this arc echoes the beginning beats from the series. It's sweet and nostalgic to go through Ichigo's day and be reacquainted with some of our old friends. And yet, that pleasant nostalgia quickly begins to fade as we understand the true reality of the situation. The world has irrevocably changed, and yet Ichigo is back to where he started. Worse than that. He's just a kid. He can't see ghosts, he can't help his friends, and he just has to put his head down and try to get by. You can feel that in the year and a half since we saw Ichigo last, he hasn't been doing well. He's frequently away from home, he's trying to make as much money as possible to move out, his relationship with his father can hardly even be called that, and only recently has he been able to mention the Soul Society by name. Sure, there are plenty of new aspects in his life, but it looks to me like someone trying to fill all hours of the day, never giving himself a second to reflect on what has happened. Ichigo Kurosaki is a 17-year-old war veteran, only he can't tell anyone what has happened, he can't acknowledge what he's done, and the next time he will ever be able to see some of his closest friends is when he dies. The world has irrevocably changed, and yet Ichigo is back to where he started. No, worse than that. And just as we begin to understand the depths of Ichigo's despair, a man arrives saying that he can help Ichigo get his powers back. This is an intriguing premise, even more so because it subtly shifts the tone of the story. Instead of an in-your-face action adventure like we've been used to, the fullbring arc is a crime noir. The tone of this arc, especially at the beginning, is more somber, more slow burn. Look at this framing here. A stranger comes in, offering our down-on-his-luck lead a job. Ichigo knows it's trouble, he's left that life behind him. But even though he says no, he's pushed to become involved regardless. Kubo plays with the art style, dipping into the low-key lighting so often seen in detective films of the 30s, and plays with the angles and the framing to make the story appear moodier and more grim. And even though a decent part of this arc is once more about Ichigo training to regain his powers, it's sandwiched around Ichigo and his friends trying to figure out what's going on and who they can trust. In many ways, this arc is a compelling psychological thriller, as the villain of this arc, Tsukishima, not only seems to know everything about them, but also has the ability to insert himself into the lives of anyone he cuts. Whereas Aizen was too removed from Ichigo to ever be a compelling antagonist, Tsukishima is incredibly, pressingly suited to oppose Ichigo. Tsukishima can make every fight personal, through direct means or by proxy, which isn't a challenge Ichigo has ever had to face before. If we're being honest, I'm not entirely certain that he can. One of my favorite parts of this arc is when Ichigo returns home not only to find Tsukishima waiting for him, but also having used his powers on Karen and Yuzu. While Ichigo has been running around preparing for open combat like usual, Tsukishima has been playing the espionage game, secretly turning Ichigo's friends and gathering as much information as he can. It doesn't matter that at this point Ichigo has unlocked his fullbring. It wouldn't even matter if Ichigo had his Bankai. He could be the most powerful person in the entire world, and he still could not beat Tsukishima because Ichigo's family will always be there to get in the way, to drag him back, and to tell him to be grateful. This is Tsukishima. How could you treat your best friend like this? Your beloved cousin. Your savior. How could you be so ungrateful to the man that has given you so much? It's a good, realistic moment of psychological horror, and it's conveyed in a few scant pages. Being completely isolated from those you love, being lectured about how you're acting crazy when you know you're the only one in your right mind is horrifying on a fundamental level. Ichigo is so clearly taken to the brink here, lashing out in impotent violence because that's all he can do. He can't stop Tsukishima, and they both know it. Doesn't have the time, space, or skill to even try telling everyone what happened, and has to deal with an entire room of loved ones looking at him like he's this unhinged, violent freak. Which, if we're being entirely honest, probably hits a little too close to home. It's telling that all Ichigo can think to do here is run, fleeing desperate and barefoot into the night. He's never fled from a fight before, not like this, not when he knew there were people relying on him, people that he needed to protect and make sure were safe. But in this moment, he's just a 17-year-old kid, scared and helpless with nowhere to turn. It only lasts a few pages, but I love that it's Misakumi that comes and finds him, this one bastion in the sea of child endangerment that is Bleach, and yet it breaks my heart. It says something that she sees this kid, this troublesome part-time worker that she can hardly wrangle into the office some days, frantic and barefoot as he runs away from his home. And yet she is not surprised. It says something that he actually wants to tell her. Ichigo, the boy that keeps everything bottled up until he can punch through his problems. It makes me wonder if there actually is another authority figure he actually trusts. That's why it's all the more devastating when Tsukishima gets her, too. You can't run, Ichigo. You can't fight. Tsukishima knows everything about you, and there is nowhere else to go. This arc is incredibly accurate in how manipulators isolate and destabilize people into doing something they would never do under normal circumstances. Tsukishima's mounting threat has been fairly incremental this entire time, and it's led us to a false sense of security. We can take him, we've seen worse. Ichigo just needs to put his nose to the grindstone like always and get his powers back. But once Tsukishima makes his final push, it's too late. Ichigo is yet again helpless, one kid facing the terrors threatening the people he loves. He's backed into a corner, he's at wit's end, and when Ginjo explains just how few options they have left facing Tsukishima, Ichigo proposes that they kill him. Ichigo is 17, And he's contemplating murder to save his friends. He's contemplating murder even if it doesn't free them. At least then Tsukishima won't be around to manipulate them anymore. It's a dark, brutal moment, and it's well earned. He has already attained godlike powers, has already accepted his bloodlust, has already killed someone. As I said in my last video, the part of Ichigo that makes him a compelling shonen protagonist is the part that is no longer fit for normal society. And while he has pretended nobly for the last year and a half that he is nothing but a normal kid, it is all too easy for him to go back to war. They're interrupted before Ichigo can say out loud whether he wants to actually go through with it, but look at his eyes. He believes murder is his only way out. The terrible part is that this is based on a lie. The fullbring arc isn't just about destabilizing someone until they do something heinous. It's also about destroying their personal relationships until they have no one else to rely on but you. It's about making them dependent on you, making them trust you, making them give up their weaknesses to you so that you can stab them in the back. The reveal that Ginjo is the secret mastermind of this whole plot is a punch in the gut. He never cared about Ichigo, he just wanted to steal his power, and he preyed on Ichigo's ideals to do it. These pages are heartbreaking, because we may have thought Ichigo was at an absolute low before. We may have thought that he was truly helpless and alone, but it's only when he wails in frustration and pain that we realize he is truly done. He trusted someone, he did his best, and then they betrayed him, and he lost. The rain falls on the sea, sharp and sudden, as though summoned by Ichigo's despair. Even the downpour is not enough to hide that he is crying in hopeless pain. And then the cavalry arrives in the form of the Shinigami, and hope is restored. This last part of the arc is just fun. The pacing is tighter and faster than the rest of the arc, and we get the gratification of seeing characters that we have missed for months now show up and show off. They also allow us to experience what I think, at least, is the best bit of storytelling in the entire arc. I'm pretty tepid on the Fullbringers for most of their runtime. They're fairly generic shonen dudes who are largely riffs on Kubo's favorite archetypes. Cute tsundere, frosty child expert, tough middle-aged woman, and a fusty, law-abiding middle-aged man. Most of the time, they're gimmicks without much substance, and it's easy to skim past them because we've seen this whole trick done before. But I love the way Kubo reveals their backstory. It's an incredibly effective bit of flash fiction, drilling into each character's personal trauma and motivation in a total of 9 pages. It makes them snap into focus in retrospect, explains their strange powers, and it gives context to their obsession with becoming strong enough to survive. It also helps explain how they fell under the wing of someone like Ginjo and were convinced that draining a 17-year-old like a battery was a reasonable thing to do. Jackie's story particularly stabs me in the kidneys, but that's probably because she's one of a handful of Bleach characters that feels like she really belongs in zombie powder, and I mourn its loss every single day. Rest in power. The execution's backstory is such a tiny thing, 9 pages in a 15-year-long story, but it's showing such a high level of technical mastery that it's honestly difficult to realize just how much Kubo is doing. He is telling the deeply traumatic, deeply personal, completely separate stories of 4 different people, and yet distilling them down so that they make sense in the context of why they came together and how they were all impacted so intensely that they felt justified in doing the abhorrent things they are doing. From giving each person's page a different pattern border, to varying the narrative voices, to balancing some very aggressive visual language, to more emotionally distant and complicated prose. There is so much happening here that I also want these pages on my wall, except they're weird and sad and they show a bunch of really terrible things, so I won't. This probably feels like a weird digression when I'm talking about the much broader arcs of the Big Sword Testosterone manga, but I think it's worth noting that right in the middle of the 15-year-long epic that is Bleach, Kubo is able to tell 4 people's very complicated, very personal stories in a matter of 9 pages, and makes me deeply care about people that I thought were cardboard characters up until this point. It's just an unexpected gem right at the end of the arc, and I'm just delighted that it exists. I think it's really cool. So I've talked about all the nice stuff in this arc. You probably know what's coming next. I do not like the fullbring arc, but I could almost love it, and that honestly makes things worse. Firstly, I have some very complicated feelings about the soft reset. On one hand, it's an interesting and effective way to send us into a new era. It wipes the board of all of that long-reaching Aizen drama and gets us ready for a new series of problems. And I like the commentary it poses on both Ichigo and the world. We may be back at the beginning, but Ichigo and his friends have fundamentally changed, and they will always be changed. You cannot send a teenager into a battlefield and expect them to roll out the other side the same. It also patches over the issue of Ichigo's power creep and justifies how he can still have a sense of growth without it feeling completely arbitrary and useless after going God mode to defeat Aizen. On the other hand, it skips over the resolution to most of my favorite themes, mini arcs, and character moments in the series when it doesn't put them in a shallow grave entirely. Huecamundo, as said by someone who is a great big dirty Huecamundo apologist, is very invested in the pure profane paradigm between Shinigami, Hollows, Vizards, and Arrancar, but it doesn't actually resolve any of the questions that it poses. Which is fine considering the blurry transition period between it and fake Karakura. But then fake Karakura also doesn't resolve anything, because it's very fixated on getting rid of Aizen and focusing on Ichigo's macro journey of attaining power. Instead, this very, very important theme is just left to fade. Some of the Vizards integrate into the Soul Society off-screen, the Arrancar disappear into the 1,000-year Blood War arc, and Ichigo loses his powers, so he doesn't really have to worry about controlling his inner hollow after all. And while, theoretically, Fullbringers might offer some closure about the corrupting nature of hollow powers, Kubo never really explores what it means to be a Fullbringer. They claim that they want to be rid of their dark, sinful powers because it is a stain on their souls. But that's a lie to just convince Ichigo to go along with what they're doing, and it's also a lie that's not very soundly delivered. That sense of corruption or dark temptation haunting the Vizards is curiously lacking in the Fullbringers, and it always has been. If anything, the Fullbringers are just traumatized people who coincidentally found out that, oh yeah, they have very cool powers. Any misuse or problems from those powers either stem from being children that don't know better, or being an unhinged misogynist that thinks it's cool to murder your wife as a science experiment. And let's be honest, I don't know how this man could get much worse. It's just weirdly empty of emotional intention or depth, especially for Ichigo. A year and a half ago, Ichigo delved into his hollow powers so deeply that he became a monster, and yet it's a variation of these powers that he's pursuing yet again. You would think he would have something to say about that. But the Fullbringer arc doesn't really care about the story that came before. With the exception of Ichigo losing his powers, there isn't any sense of direct continuity, and this honestly offends me. I am genuinely, actually offended that the Fullbringer arc doesn't care about what came before. Huecamundo and fake Karakura Town consist of the worst day of our main crew's lives because, yes, this all happened in a single day. It's even worse for Ichigo because he was in the Dangai for 3 months, locked in constant battle with his Zanpakuto. There should be history here. There should be fallout. There should be some sense that our characters were directly impacted by what they saw, felt, and did. And there is vaguely. It's clear that they have matured somewhat, but all of that good character growth happened off screen. Which is a gripe that you are going to hear over and over again. It almost feels like Kubo hangs a lantern on it, when Orihime literally turns to Ichigo / the audience and says, "Did you think we didn't actually do anything for the last 17 months? And I kind of want to go, Yeah, honestly, because I thought the point of this time skip was to show that nothing important had happened for anyone because you were at peace now, rather than illustrating how life has passed Ichigo specifically by, and he's even more isolated and lonely than I thought to begin with. But sure, cool. I like your new power-up. I wish it ever mattered again. The Shinigami arriving honestly makes things worse, because even though they are very fun and engaging sections and they kick up the story a whole lot, they rock up and tell us they have changed. It was very hard, actually. Don't worry about it. We suffered and sweated a lot, just off screen. Now watch Renji backhand a stone pillar so hard it crumbles into dust and whoops! There went all that effort to stop power creep. Not even just joke stuff either. Ruki is a vice captain now. That's a huge change. I would have loved to see her earn this advancement, to convince her brother to allow it to happen. That sure would have been a gratifying character beat considering she's ironically on ice until her Bankai reveal, but sure! Cool! I like your new power-up! The soft reset puts this arc on the back foot because it is having to start from scratch instead of build on the themes and ideas like the arcs before. At this point, we are accustomed to a fake Karakura Town level of lore. We are used to things being complicated and nuanced and working in the most particular niche spaces. But by virtue of the story structure, we are having to start over, and it really shows. The Fullbringers are just demonstrably less developed as a group when it comes to ideology, power sets, personal relationships, and history. I get that they are just a group of people thrown together by circumstance, but they have virtually no identity beyond vaguely related trauma and falling in the same cult of personality that is Ginjo, which, fun fact, is only acknowledged a few chapters from the end and left largely as inference. We don't know how they get here. We don't know what important developments happen between the end of their backstory and them deciding to manipulate Ichigo. We don't even know how Ginjo came to pull them together. Even the mechanics of how fullbringing works, the bread and butter of Bleach, combat magic, feels rushed and sloppy. I'm willing to play in the space of silly magic powers, obviously, but fullbrings feel suspiciously like Kubo filing off the serial numbers from a Bankai. Which, yes, I understand is a bit of a silly nitpick considering Resurrections are functionally Bankai as well, but their distinctions are carefully considered. The way they are engaged is different, the timbre of the physical changes are different, the rules are different. Fullbrings are clothes or devices or spaces where people can do things, and there aren't clear limitations except for incredibly arbitrary ones, and they functionally possess godlike powers, and I'm really nervous even pointing this part out because it threatens to undermine the execution's entire motivation, which I do not have time to get into. But the Fullbringers only lose because they don't have as much experience as the centuries-old Shinigami they face. I mean, Kubo just reuses the same word to describe everything about them. Did you notice that? It happened 3 times in the last paragraph. They are Fullbringers that possess a Fullbring to perform a Fullbring, an act called Fullbringing, and at any time they can engage Bringer Light, which I'm pretty sure was at least once translated as a Fullbring! I'm not crazy to say this feels phoned in, right? I'm not some weirdo out here tilting at windmills. These are just less developed than the Shinigami, Quincy, Hollows, Vizard, and Arrancar that we have already encountered. They are the pivotal group of people of this story, and they're barely developed, and it makes me specifically angry. While we're on the subject, here's another thing that bothers me specifically, and likely no one else. This arc is short. Like, really short. I don't say this to show, oh, Fullbring arc bad because not enough chapters, because the length of a story absolutely does not reflect the quality. Instead, we should acknowledge that the more ideas you have in a story, the more time it's going to take to appropriately deal with them all. And depending on the gravity of some, they might take a little longer than expected. Something like your 17-year-old protagonist solving the plot by murdering someone. He's 17, and he knows the taste of blood. To be clear, I wouldn't say that the storytelling in this arc is sloppy. There aren't any major hanging threads, characters don't randomly appear or disappear, and the internal logic of what's going on always holds fast. Everything I would expect to be here is present and accounted for, but it's done a little too quickly and slightly out of place. It's this weird situation where Kubo feels so busy with trying to make the plot work that the subtler details were delayed too long or not developed quite enough. See Isshin and Urahara skulking around, or Rukia's voice coming out of the badge. They all point in the right direction, but only in retrospect and with a bird's eye view. It almost feels like I'm reading a detailed outline of the story rather than the story itself. All of the breathing room has been edited out, all of the places where we could digest the heaps of information about the world, people, and powers we're dealing with are gone. Which leaves us with the very counterintuitive problem of the information density being a lot higher in this arc, so readers are having to work harder to understand what's going on, which then means it's slowing down the story and making it feel boring. The fullbring arc is somehow too short for what it's trying to achieve, and yet feels like it's lasting forever. My recollection of this arc from when it was releasing weekly was that it lasted years, because it felt like I was doing fullbring homework instead of being able to enjoy the problems these characters were going through. It's honestly kind of confusing, because serialized stories like Bleach don't usually have these kinds of problems. When you're allowed to take the story a week at a time and the arc ends when you decide, or you get cancelled, you don't really have to rush. Instead, serialization is more victim to bloat, where the story meanders, really taking its time to luxuriate in the details instead of getting to the point. Usually, the kinds of pacing issues that the fullbring arc experiences only crop up when the creator knows there's an end in sight, and they're trying to make everything fit before time is up. Which leads me to my little pet theory. Kubo did this on purpose. Not to tell the story badly, of course, but rather, he intentionally chose to tell the fullbring arc in a certain number of chapters. Perhaps even a close approximation of the chapters in the Substitute Shinigami arc. You know, the arc that this one is so closely evoking. I genuinely can't tell if this is a big reveal or a very obvious yeah, no duh moment. I've been thinking about Bleach for easily 6 months nonstop, and I feel like my brain is melting out of my ears, but this would honestly answer a lot of my questions. But also, I'm in conspiracy theory land. I know this. This is tinfoil hat nonsense about the pacing of a manga. It's clearly not a one-to-one comparison. The fullbring arc is 55 chapters, while the Substitute Shinigami arc is generally agreed to be about 70, although we get really close if we end the arc with Renji and Byakuya rocking up to steal Rukia, which, you know, is a thing I absolutely can do. And if Kubo does have this endpoint in mind, if he is so clearly trying to evoke the Substitute Shinigami arc, that explains the breakneck pace, the hasty way he wraps up things in the last 3 chapters, and also this comment in an interview I read where he definitively announced the next arc being short. Would I be happy if I knew I was right? No! No, the story delivery is still lacking, and I would have preferred a fully fleshed out narrative instead of a cute little gimmick. But also this gives me even a shred of an explanation for why this arc is paced the way it is. Like, I think not knowing and just it being because is worse for me because it's so counterintuitive. Bleach never wants for time, and yet here we have this weird little 6-volume arc that has all of the fat stripped out. Honestly, I feel the same about the 1000-Year Blood War arc, as I personally suspect that Jump magazine gave Kubo a hard end date once he said that he wanted to finish things, and it was probably only a few months out, which explains why stuff just happens at the end before the epilogue. Kubo doesn't seem to plan extensively when it comes to storytelling, but it's clear that he does know where he wants to go and has the broad strokes of the characters and stories ahead of time. If he was focused more on including all of the details he could before time was up, rather than trying to weave together a simpler but more airtight story, it would help make this arc make more sense. This also hooks into the issue of pacing. If Kubo was aware that he didn't have much time to tell this story, he needs to be very sure everything is meted out properly. It doesn't matter how great your character's world or plot are if things aren't dealt with in the time, manner, or consistency they're supposed to be. Although I praised how Kubo told us about the Fullbringers, I am very disappointed at when he chose to do so. The reason I was so chilly towards the Fullbringers was because Kubo didn't engage with them until after the reveal that they were the villains, which is a big problem because a lot of this story hinges on 2 big twists. Tsukishima turning everyone against Ichigo, and the reveal that the executioners were playing Ichigo from the beginning. A betrayal isn't a betrayal if it's a stranger doing it, but because Kubo was trying to make everything else work. Because he only dripped in a couple of hints and only gave answers in that slam dunk of microfiction at the very end, the impact of Ichigo being fattened for the slaughter falls way below where it's supposed to be. The foundation is there. It's clear that Kubo had at least some idea about the motivations for these characters. It's scattered in everything they do, but without taking the time to actually tell us, the audience, what kind of people they are, it feels far more meaningless and shallow than it actually is. This also goes for Tsukishima. Did you notice that I had way less to say about him than I did Aizen? I vaguely complimented him and said he was sneaky. It's because I don't know anything else about him. I cannot express how difficult it is going through an entire arc not knowing a thing about the main bad guy, except that apparently he's cunning and I guess likes books, only to cut to the second to last chapter and get this absolute soul render of a page. Why didn't you teach me what to do when you died? Tsukishima has built himself in an image that Ginjo would approve of. He would follow him blindly into hell, he would help him stalk and manipulate and terrorize a group of teens for the sake of clawing back Ginjo's powers, because Ginjo is his guide and savior. Now that Ginjo is dead, Tsukishima is left stumbling around in the dark, alone and weeping for his foster father, even as he knows that he too will soon die. Only one person comes to find him, Shishigawara, his disciple, the boy that Tsukishima does not care for half so much as Shishigawara cares for him. I can't help but wonder if this is a dark reflection of Tsukishima's relationship with Ginjo. Tsukishima would throw his life away at Ginjo's command. He would play the villain, he would torture and torment and try to kill children. But Ginjo never seems to care much about him. Not lately, at least. Not even when he feels him on the brink of death. Standing before Shishigawara, Tsukishima knows, in this second, that the delusion has fallen from the boy's eyes. Shishigawara knows that he's been used. He knows that Tsukishima has been leading him along because he is a very valuable pawn. The seed of doubt was planted in his brain by Ikkaku, and now he's here as a reckoning. This is it. This is the end of the cycle. It is fitting, we think, because it was wrought by Tsukishima's own hands. And the cycle does break, because instead of offering violence, Shishigawara offers him comfort and carries him into town on his own back. Tsukishima dies experiencing kindness and love that he knows he has not earned, and possibly, hopefully, reflecting on what he himself has done. Would it make you mad if I told you all this was pure inference because the story declines to engage with Tsukishima's headspace before now? Because it makes me mad! We didn't have time to develop him. We didn't get any chance to engage with any of the ideas he presents because we're too busy gunning through fistfuls of other ideas, and I'm so mad! You know how I said he was a good villain for Ichigo to face? That's almost entirely theory. Outside of that one moment I mentioned and a brief fight where nothing happens, they never interact. Tsukishima is a mere concept until the end of the arc because we have too much crap going on to actually spend time on his character, so I have to resort to writing fan fiction in my own dadgum analysis to develop this man and make all of his potential actually make sense as a character. I am chewing my keyboard at this wasted opportunity. Okay, I'm adequately worked up and I've covered everything else. Time to talk about Ginjo. Theoretically, Ginjo Kugo makes sense as a counterpoint to Ichigo. They're both substitute Shinigami that were badly used by a system that does not respect them as people, but rather very useful to them. I'm still angry reading this. I need to change modes. They are both former substitute Shinigami that were badly used by a system that does not respect them as people. While Ichigo is currently on a depression spiral, Ginjo has hardened and turned aggressive, wanting recompense for the harm done to him. Ginjo very aptly points out the corruptions and crimes of the Gotei 13, revealing that the very badge Ichigo cherishes as the icon of his power, the thing he uses as a focal point of his fullbring, the thing he has carried around with him for 17 months, even though it remained useless and inert, has also been used to track him and arbitrarily limit his power. If Ichigo steps out of line, the Soul Society is prepared to kill him immediately. They told a 15-year-old boy to trust them, but were ready to kill him if he became inconvenient. The Gotei 13 is, at the very best, a deeply suspect institution that is more interested in control rather than moral decency, and Ginjo is correct to decry them as such. In many ways, Ginjo is a dark warning of what Ichigo might become. A charismatic yet jaded, bitter, and violent leader that cares more about his own sense of rightness and getting what he wants at any cost. It's an interesting conflict. Everything I want. Personal stakes, serious themes, a complicated situation with no easy resolution. I love all of that. Unfortunately, Ginjo is an unhinged weirdo that decided to stalk a 17-year-old for an undisclosed amount of time, manipulate him, isolate him from his friends, nearly murder one of said friends just to see if Ichigo would pick up on the clue, and all for the sake of draining Ichigo like a battery. And why, do you ask? Why would he do these terrible things? Because the Soul Society stripped him of his power after he went on a killing spree. Sure, I understand that he just learned they were monitoring him, and that is very upsetting. See above, the Gotei 13 is a deeply suspect institution. But that is not justification for going on a killing spree. I hate this man. He is my enemy, and I do not respect him. Don't get in the comments, YouTube. I will not be receiving your Ginjo defenses today. The thing that frustrates me about Ginjo is that, like so many things in this arc, he is so close to being perfect. He is so close to a home run. I am all for the havoc of Ichigo grappling with a ruthless manipulator, one that sinks his claws into all of Ichigo's insecurities and twists until he's destabilized enough to do exactly what Ginjo wants. Ginjo has the tactics down pat. He promises Ichigo a prize that he can't attain anywhere else. He plays on Ichigo's savior complex. He's clearly stalking and keeping information about Ichigo. He isolates Ichigo from his friends through violence and manipulation. He makes Ichigo doubt his authority figures. He puts Ichigo through emotionally and physically demanding gauntlets. He injures and frightens Ichigo when he doesn't obey Ginjo's every word. He threatens people Ichigo cares about, and he's always the first one on scene when Ichigo is experiencing a crisis. And Ichigo, intelligent and willful though he may be, is a prime target for someone like this. He's already disaffected and cynical about authority figures, longing for connection, gains self-worth through helping and protecting others, is reckless and self-sacrificial, and is currently in the midst of a depression spiral so intense that most of his friends spend their interactions playing emotional keep-away, trying to protect him from the things they know would send him careening down even further. Ichigo is woefully unprepared to deal with an enemy like this, and just as he was helpless against Tsukishima, he is helpless against Ginjo. That is what makes the plot twist hurt so badly. Not just that Ichigo couldn't see this coming, but we couldn't see anything else. Except that's not really the story that was told, now was it? I mean, yes, Ginjo did all of those weird bad things, but you see that? Just that highlighted text right there? That happened when Ginjo had a bunch of false memories put into his brain to hide the fact that he was manipulating Ichigo because he's such a bad liar. So although this is a manipulation in the long term, in the short term, Ginjo didn't actually do those very specific acts with the intent of making Ichigo dependent on him. He did that because that's what Ginjo thinks is a normal, healthy, reasonable thing to do to an ally. You blinded a 17-year-old as an object lesson! Ginjo makes my head hurt because he presents two relatively similar but fundamentally incompatible stories. Either he's doing everything on purpose with the intention of manipulating Ichigo, and Kubo wants us to see that he's being a bad man, or he's a good ally that, surprise, was actually evil all along and we couldn't see it coming. You cannot do both. Kubo tries a couple of times to wave away the screwed up things Ginjo does by saying, he was just messing around, or having a character bluntly state, oh, he's a terrible liar. We could all see that he was pretending. But Ginjo's vibes are so consistently rancid that I didn't interpret this as a joke or a farce. I interpreted this as the facade slipping a little too much, and Ichigo being too out of it to realize how bad things are. Because otherwise, it makes Ichigo look like a big dumb idiot for not noticing that Ginjo's vibes are rancid. The man basically confesses to stalking Ichigo when they first met, and tries to turn him against his father, but then later admits it was a lie to capture Ichigo's attention. He puts Ichigo through some of the worst training sequences in all of Bleach because he's constantly tossing him to the wolves and refusing to explain how things actually work, then berates him for not figuring things out fast enough. Everything this man does screams that he's evil, that he is lying, and that Ichigo really shouldn't be dealing with him. But I'm supposed to believe that he's actually a good guy, and I don't get it. I also can't sympathize with a man that resolves a violation of privacy by murdering a bunch of random people, disappearing into the night, then planning further revenge by trying to drain a teenager like a battery and then acts like this is a holy war. They worried you would be unhinged and then you murdered a bunch of people, Ginjo. You are validating the bad actions of others. I feel deranged because this man is pointing at the Soul Society like they are bad when he is the one validating their bad behavior. I don't think Kubo had a clear idea of what to do with Ginjo. There are thoughtful hints of his betrayal scattered throughout, like Ishida being physically attacked instead of spiritually like the rest of the gang, or Ichigo's fullbring being designed to look good on Ginjo, foreshadowing his theft of Ichigo's fullbring. But the execution is too sloppy for me to give any serious credit. Ginjo is as messy and convoluted as the plans he creates, with all of these different facets jangling around inside of him, but never actually making sense. He's a good guy, he's a manipulator, he's a tryhard, he's a hero, he's a villain, he's a tragedy, he's a monster of his own creation, he's self-aware, he's blind, he's getting on my dadgum nerves. I like to think that if we had more time to develop him, we would have had a far more cohesive character that, although not perfect, would have made more sense, but at this point, who knows? The story keeps flip-flopping back and forth, and the more that I'm told Ginjo is cool and cunning and smart and respectable, the more I flip back to a previous chapter or conversation or even page and go, huh, that sure is an on-the-nose and uncomfortably low morals thing you just said. When I look back at this arc, I keep asking myself what the point of it is. Why did Kubo tell this story? Why did we meet these people? Why did we go through all of these things? Maybe I'm missing the forest for the trees, but it feels like everything this arc has to say is either redundant or forgotten completely. It introduces a new group and type of powers into the world, but they're poorly developed and literally have no bearing on the plot beyond this arc, with the exception of a plot contrivance at the end that makes me want to throw myself down a mountain. It underlines the dubious nature of the Soul Society and Ichigo's positive impact on it, but we already knew that, and the 1000-Year Blood War arc drives home the point far better. It shows how Ichigo deals with the loss of power and the pursuit to regain it, but even the revelation that he is now ready to kill people if forced is never revisited again. It develops the lore of the world, specifically in regard to Chad and how people can develop powers, but it's shallow, and doesn't actually develop Chad. It shows that Ichigo really has a complicated relationship with his authority figures, loving them and yet not trusting them to be of any help for the problem he faces. But we knew that as well. It introduces a new tone and mode of storytelling, but that peters out halfway through the arc. People tell me this arc is good and meaty and it develops Ichigo and it shows new sides of him, and it's vital to understand his mental space, but I am struggling to understand where that could possibly occur, in and around the most convoluted and asinine plot in the entirety of Bleach. This is an entire arc, and yet it just feels like a transition period, something that we have to do to get to the more pressing and interesting story of the 1000-Year Blood War, which is just sad. This story is worth more than just being connective tissue. This arc has good bones. I like everything that it's trying to do. I appreciate the story that it could be if it just had more time. But instead, I'm just left holding a bunch of really good bones. What is the point of this arc? I'm really scared it's to undo the sacrifice Ichigo just made. Final verdict. I'm frustrated because it could have been great out of 10. 1000-Year Blood War. This is it, the last arc of Bleach. The beginning of the end. The 1000-Year Blood War arc feels like a curious mix between the Soul Society and fake Karakura Town. The first half in particular is fun, probably the most fun Bleach has been in years. It's punchy, high stakes, compelling, and quite clever in its schemes. Ichigo is lured to Hueco by an Arrancar with strange Quincy powers. Meanwhile, the Soul Society faces a terrible invasion from elite Quincy that have been hiding in the shadows, biding their time to strike. This is the Soul Society's reckoning. They committed a genocide, so now the survivors have returned, stronger and more vicious than ever before, led by the father of all Quincy. Yhwach. This, they make very clear, is an act of holy revenge. It is an act of holy justice. The Shinigami have to puzzle through harrowing conclusions, both about themselves, the people they work with, and the people they are opposing. Kubo then further raises the stakes by having the Quincy steal Bankai, hobbling the most powerful warriors in the series and leaving the Soul Society defenseless. The wreckage is devastating as the entire Soul Society is turned into a war zone. Kubo introduces a series of lower-level Shinigami, engages us with their day-to-day lives, and we think that perhaps they are the new generation, a new crop of people Ichigo will interact with in the arc to come. Nope. These people are literally just cannon fodder. Normally, I dislike this kind of storytelling, introducing a whole flock of characters just to fatten them up for the slaughter. But Bleach has never done this before, and it was used to great effect, so good job. That actually really hurt me. This arc just feels fresher than the ones before it, like Kubo had found a new creative well. Dialogue is punchier, personal conflicts are more pronounced, and character designs and power sets are suddenly far more complex and interesting than the vague, underdeveloped ones of the execution. Look at these dudes. That's Turbo Bleach, Supreme Bleach, Ultra Nega Genesis Bleach. This man has checkerboard teeth. And as a deep lover of Fuecomundo, I like how down and dirty these fights are. They're brutal, they're violent, they have a cost. How do you get over panels like this? I don't even like Hitsugaya, and I don't know how to get over a panel like this. Things are just brutal and bleak for the Gote 13, and I just like the menace of the Stern Ritter. In the story so far, the Shinigami have largely sailed through most of their encounters, but now they're having to reassess the attitudes and practices that landed them in this situation. Sancho 46 has been replaced, Yamamoto is dead, and the consequences of their actions are now staring everyone in the face, so they must learn from their mistakes or die. The younger generations are coming forward and overturning the new, and it just feels good watching these characters flourish. They worked hard for these moments. They suffered and they lost and they stood back up and fought, and I enjoy that victory isn't handed to them on a platter. All of the conflict here is completely earned. The Stern Ritter are Yhwach's best, holiest warriors, and they have been planning this crusade a long time. Framing them as sacred warriors like the Knights Templar is an interesting, provocative decision, because it instantly sets them apart from the Shinigami and Arrancar. The Fullbringers aren't even worth mentioning here. Duh. They're just some dudes. The Fullbringers are just some dudes. What are they doing? The Stern Ritter aren't fighting for mundane practicalities like honor, duty, competition, or survival. They are fighting for salvation. The name of their leader literally evokes divinity, Yahweh, and he has commanded that they wage a holy war, so war they will wage. It's not a fully developed idea just because of how Kubo chose to prioritize some things, but it's tasty. I go crazy for stuff like this. We fought against good men and we fought against bad men, but now we must contend with the righteous. While I'm on the subject of the Stern Ritter, it's worth noting that, yeah, there's a good case for them being coded as specifically fascists, which has some merit to it. I'm entirely aware that as a Westerner, I am basically hard-coded to see someone speaking German and wearing a very particular kind of uniform and draw specific conclusions, but the visual imagery here is very specific, shall we say? I'm not against that as an idea, because I've grown up with this imagery being a very easy shorthand for the worst dudes you're ever going to encounter here. But also, the greater context of Bleach makes this kind of messy. Having the survivors of an ethnic purge return looking like the fascist army that very specifically did a whole bunch of ethnic purges, especially when the Stern Ritter aren't developed beyond a few villainous speeches and a hurried backstory or two. This entire arc is best summed up as it's messy, but this is also a deeper tangent than I'm really ready to get into, and I just think the Holy Knight's interpretation is stronger and certainly more consistent, so that's the one I'm going with. I'm not certain what Kubo's intentions are here. It feels pretty on the nose, but it's also not something he's engaging with very deeply, so it's messy, let's move on. In general, the 1,000-Year Blood War feels like it was just made to make people happy. This one is for the fans, and Kubo most of all. He's talked about in some interviews how the anime had ended by the time he was starting this arc, so he was able to draw things that he wanted without having to deal with censorship, and it really shows. Again, you can just feel that he's pulling out all of the stops, throwing in as much insane crap as he feels he physically can. There are cool fights, interesting backstories, exquisite panels and poses, and a victory lap for all of the old faces. I don't think I can convey the depths of emotion I felt when I say I was faithful. For 5 years, I knew Grimjaw was alive this whole time, and I was rewarded. I was faithful. I genuinely felt lightheaded the first time I read this. They could hear me screaming on the sun. And just like fake Karakura Town, it's nice to have these moments where it's just Kubo pointing to us in the crowd and then spiking us the biggest moment that we could possibly have. There are a lot of cool ideas and unexpected moments in this arc that, frankly, I didn't think we would see the timbre of again. I'm thrilled I was able to go back and actually appreciate what Kubo is doing. All that said, 1,000-Year Blood War is messy. This arc is difficult to discuss simply because it's so vast, clocking in at just under a third of the entire series, and so predictably, it covers a lot more ground and ideas. But even given those parameters, I would say there are just too many. The focus of the arc once more too broad and loosely defined. I appreciate the grand ambitions of this arc, but I would appreciate a focused, efficient arc much more. Even the themes that I would expect to be vital to this arc, such as the parallels between Ichigo and Ishida, the sins of the fathers being paid, or perhaps punished, by the sons, cultures built on secrecy or control being destroyed by the very things they try to hide, or the isolating nature of supreme power, they're all largely absent. The breadth of this arc is distinctly at the cost of the depth, and what little depth we do get is so sporadic that it barely even warrants the name. It's such a big issue that I'm concerned this part of my analysis will sound equally unfocused and chaotic. So much of this section is me waving at things that simply aren't there or not cohesive enough to really make sense, and I'm trying to express how disappointed that makes me. Even distilling the themes that are here and analyzing them like I've done previously threatens to make the story more cohesive than it actually is. There are so many storylines and ideas that some of them are inevitably neglected for so long that you forget about them or lose investment in them. Just off the top of my head, you have finding strength through knowledge, defining yourself beyond other people's expectations, the importance of cooperation, and the danger of blind devotion all competing for space, as well as about 8 Bankai reveals, a couple thematic parallels, and a few plot twists, all crammed into our beloved frenemy, the classic Bleach format. It's like reading fake Karakura Town all over again, but with more people, crazier powers, and an entire cast of enemies that we extra don't know and are trying to backfill investment in on the fly. It's just too much, and that's reflected in how the story abruptly starts pairing off storylines just so Kubo can drag Ichigo's narrative to the finish. That said, I'm hesitant to describe any particular part of the story as bad, because that dismisses the vast majority of things Kubo is doing right. The art is truly exquisite, the character interactions are interesting, the fights are often engaging, and there is thought placed into the story beats, such as juxtaposing Nanao and Nemu coming into their own. But we cannot deny the sloppiness of the story. The lapses in logic, janky pacing, prioritizing side characters over our main crew, and enough speechifying to peel the paint from my walls. The last 20 or so chapters in particular are rough, as Kubo is clearly trying to reach his deadline and cram in all of the things he wanted, but at the cost of any sort of consistent pace, sense of tension, or gratifying release. The story doesn't even feel like it knows where it's supposed to end. Everything from the framing of this fight says the story should conclude in chapter 679. Ichigo showing off his new powers, Orihime recognizing the progress he has made since the Lust chapters, Ichigo proudly, defiantly declaring his resolve one last time. But it doesn't end here. Instead, Yhwach beats him for incredibly arbitrary, slightly nonsensical reasons. We get a somewhat irrational deus ex machina that I'm still not certain on the logic of, a plot band-aid over what should be the most emotionally devastating moment in Ichigo's entire life, only so we can fumble our way to a conclusion with a MacGuffin that... I mean, it works. It works. That's the most I can say for Ichigo's triumph over Yhwach. It works. It's over. I don't have to keep going through this. Which is a shame. This is the ending of an era, the conclusion of a behemoth, and the strongest feeling I have is relief. It was such a difficult slog to reach the end of the story that I actually forgot most of the things that I had read, and I'm going to be honest, I wasn't pleased to have remembered. This is why Bleach has the reputation of ending on such a boring, sour note. The last 20 chapters leave a bad taste in my mouth, and that's being able to read it over an afternoon. When you have to sit through 5 months of this, waiting each week, hoping to get the old spark back, hoping to get something to make you delight in the story like you used to, but it just never comes, that's gonna be pretty difficult. The end of this arc is just disappointing in small, pervasive ways, and it retroactively weakens the entire story. But before we get into the details, I need to acknowledge Kubo's health. Kubo struggled with medical problems while making the second part of Bleach, and it became so bad that he was eventually hospitalized. He doesn't go into many specifics, and rightly so, but after reading enough interviews, the picture formed is incredibly bleak. It's just a cascade of health issues, likely stemming from stress and poor work habits. Colds lasting longer and longer, his short-term health dipping after every chapter released, the tendons in his shoulder slowly severing from bad drawing posture and a lack of meaningful breaks. The guy was not doing well, and when your health is in the trash, it's difficult to do normal day-to-day tasks, much less spearhead and conclude one of the most popular manga in the world of all time. Bleach ended because Kubo realized he could not physically carry on. I want to be very clear that I'm aware of these circumstances and their probable impact on the story, but that I am also separating my critique from them. I think anytime you start to associate a story's quality with an artist's health, you start to develop very strange standards about both things. I understand that there's a likely correlation between his health and the quality of the story, but I also think it's disingenuous to say, well, we can't judge the story because of his health. They inform each other, but they are not dependent on each other. And full transparency, I am of the opinion that an artist should never suffer for their work. I am deeply thankful that Kubo is able to produce content at his own speed instead of slowly killing himself for his art. I am also of the opinion that there are parts of this arc that are simply disappointing, confusing, and frustrating. And it is telling that Kubo is using the new anime to rework the story into something he finds more satisfying. I haven't watched the 1000-Year Blood War anime, so I don't know if he changed any of the things I'm about to discuss. But suffice to say, the story needed work. We'll start this section with some real easy, straightforward stuff. Maybe. I don't know. A major part of this arc is the reveal that Ichigo is part Quincy, and that his mother, Masaki, has greater secrets than we've already seen. I don't feel especially strong about this development, which I think is damning in and of itself. The fact that Ichigo is part Quincy, the fact that his mother wasn't a mere human as believed, the fact that Yhwach culled her because she defied his principle of blood supremacy, it's whatever. It happened. Shocked me at first, but doesn't really seem to go anywhere in retrospect. This development does dabble in the main protagonist must be the most special boy ever territory, but it's not the worst thing I've ever seen, and it's woven in far more subtly than most stories that have this kind of twist. Frankly, I'm just relieved that all of the characters are okay with this development, instead of spending chapters and chapters suddenly being weirdly bigoted towards Ichigo for no reason. That's a frustratingly common arc with these sorts of secret parentage stories, and they're exhausting when they're not just downright offensive. Other than that, and other than the tedious contrivance where Yhwach controls Ichigo's blood and then gives some trash talk a little later, it doesn't actually do anything to the plot. I don't feel any sense of payoff for Ichigo being part Quincy. I don't think Masaki being a Quincy strengthens this narrative. It's not bad by any means, merely acceptable. It's a glass of water. I'm not thrilled to drink it, but I'm not offended to have it. That's hardly encouraging for such a major reveal, but at least it does no harm. And yet, it poses other problems, because this is the driver of Ichigo's journey throughout the story. Yes, he has the ever-present need to protect, but the mini character arc that he goes on in the 1,000-Year Blood War is one of self-acceptance. We'll talk more about my feelings on that particular subject in a little bit, but I don't think this one is an especially strong story for Ichigo. Every arc is at least in part about Ichigo learning to accept himself, but it's usually tied in with some deeply scary, complicated idea that he actually has to work to accept. He's realizing it's difficult to accomplish his goal to protect. He's realizing there are genuine high stakes to protecting people. He's realizing that the pursuit of protecting people is fundamentally changing him. He's realizing that protecting people requires sacrifice, and he's realizing that people will exploit his desire to protect. And then in this arc, I want to say he's having to accept that people will lie to him in order to protect him, but that's not quite right. Nor is it quite right to say they're lying to get him to protect what they want. Nor is he even straying from this protecting motif to reconcile his prejudice with his identity. I don't know what the greater problem Ichigo grapples with here, and I think it's because there isn't any. We could argue that Ichigo isn't on a self-acceptance journey. It's actually a fight the system journey, or a rescue my friend journey, but I would argue right back that those aren't personal arcs he has to go on. They're not things he learns and grows from. They're just things he does because he has always done them. No, I'm certain this story is telling me that the journey Ichigo goes on as an individual is definitively one of change and acceptance, and it's telling me in every aspect. Ichigo says it, other people say it, his very costuming says it. Look, Ichigo changes the further along in the story we go. But the reality is, he doesn't change. Ichigo at the beginning of this arc is the same person as Ichigo at the end, and arguably, depending on how you interpret this panel, he's reaffirmed his identity from before the reboot even started. Now, Ichigo being a static character in this arc isn't an inherently bad thing. There's this mistaken idea that in order for a story to be good, you have to have your main character grow and change at all times. You cannot end in the same spot as you start. And while, yes, that is a handy rule of thumb, there are many entirely valid stories where characters do not change. Static characters can have just as compelling a story as dynamic ones, so long as they are handled correctly. Furthermore, we have to consider that in an epic fantasy like this, sometimes characters are going to reach the natural conclusion of their arcs before the conclusion of the entire series. It is okay if Ichigo concludes his character growth before the 1,000-Year Blood War. Otherwise, we are risking either undoing the character growth that he has done, or we find ourselves in the situation we're already in, being told he's growing when nothing happens at all. Instead of having Ichigo chase his tail in a weaker version of a story we've seen 5 times now, I would have really enjoyed the power of Ichigo being a rock that the other characters could rely on. Their worlds are falling apart, their homes are being destroyed, they're finding new radical powers at all times. It would be a marvelous payoff if they could look to Ichigo and draw strength from the fact that he is standing steady. And honestly, that's how it feels like Ichigo is presented for the first act of the arc. Ichigo is a constant. No matter where he is, no matter who he opposes, he'll be sure to protect the things he values. People are turning to him and trusting him to be what he has always been. In this time of crisis, they need him to be static, to have reached the conclusion of his arc to be okay. And we've earned that, haven't we? Ichigo has wrung himself dry in every single arc, coming to terms with his identity. It would make sense that, at this point, he's not so easily perturbed as he used to be. This is the result of his growth. Rather than a setback consuming his world with floods of rain, he can shrug it off and keep his skies clear. This isn't even saying that I don't want Ichigo to be part Quincy. That part can stay, I still don't feel strongly about it one way or another. But it would mean a lot more if Ichigo took it in stride, if he was able to meet the threat Yhwach poses to his identity and never flinch. He's still facing difficult villains, he's still being challenged, But instead of spending chapters on him once more angsting about who he is and then far too quickly coming to terms with that, let's just skip the middle step. It would even do double duty by carrying out a beat that we saw at the end of the fullbring arc. In this alternate version of the story, people could be tiptoeing around Ichigo, being very nervous about how he's going to take this change, projecting insecurities upon him, only for Ichigo to reassert himself from the very beginning, meeting their doubt with security. Ichigo is solid, he has been solid, he knows he's solid, so why are we wasting time on this? Let's go get the bad guy. It would certainly connect Ichigo in this first act to his most impactful moment in the third, as he defiantly, proudly declares that of course he has tasted despair, and he has stood up time and time again. Rather than the story making this be a realization he has to come to for the 6th time in a row, it can be his battle cry from the beginning, a declaration of intent to rally the entire Soul Society behind. It would certainly be more cohesive and deliberate than an arc that begins with him having completed his arc, changes its mind in the middle, and then stumbles to a shaky conclusion that rehashes what came before. It could be something I actually relish, rather than being just a glass of water. Now that we've addressed the lost opportunities of our main character, let's talk about the failings of our villain. I don't feel seething contempt for Yhwach like I do the other arc antagonists, but boy, does he get on my nerves. Yhwach is yet another omnipotent, omniscient baddie that can be everything and do anything except keep a meaningful sense of tension within the story. Regardless of what the gang does, Yhwach has a solution. Only instead of having the decency of slapping down an Uno reverse and monologuing about it, he just says, "This has no effect on me," and that's exactly what happens. Just return to sender. It doesn't matter. That's such a great thing for narrative momentum. I love this. He also has this habit of either telling bald-faced lies that no one questions, or saying something absolutely wild that Kubo then validates with the narrative, and I don't know what the difference is. He says he hates suffering, and yet constantly chooses the most manipulative, sadistic ways possible to achieve his goals. He claims that Ichigo subconsciously wants to serve Yhwach's best interest, when really, Yhwach is puppeteering Ichigo by his blood. He says he can see everything and anything, and has planned for things, but oops, actually he just controlled the future, so it's not actually planning, it's reacting, but like way after the fact, but also his powers don't work like he explained them 3 different times, and the parameters of them aren't very clear, and I still do not, to this day, fully understand why they were able to defeat him, and I'm scared it's because Kubo said, "Because I said so." Ah! I don't mind if the point is that he is a megalomaniacal narcissist, and obviously he is lying and attributing everything to himself, but that point is never clear. I think he's lying. This feels like he's lying. I have to constantly fact check him, and yeah, he's lying! But everyone just goes along with what he says anyways. Even Ichigo's token denials are undercut by things playing out exactly as Yhwach says they will, and I feel like my brain is melting out of my ears! Even the wiki is giving him a pass by saying his words have double meaning. These aren't double meanings, he's just lying! That's not how the truth works! Making sense of the things Yhwach says is incredibly difficult because he isn't very clearly defined as a character. There are nods to an interesting backstory with him. There are seeds for a deeply compelling narrative, seen in his history with Yamamoto, Haschwald, Basby, and this entire pocket dimension that the Quincy have been hiding in for centuries, but they're never developed and rarely used. All we know is that he's supremely powerful, has a god complex, and is using the sword to empower himself. But also make the world end. But also to become God? And maybe stop suffering? Do you see why I'm having difficulty with this? Yhwach feels like a terrible villain because his powers are too vast to have meaning, his motivations are vague, and any chances he has to define himself as an actual person are so obfuscated by body doubles, false timelines, and cult leader rhetoric that I have no idea what's up and what's down. This whole problem is made even more offensive when you consider how many nonsense speeches he gives that don't actually mean anything. There are pages and pages dedicated to him just monologuing at the audience, word salading his way through conversations, but they don't actually mean anything. I get a keen sense of arrogance from him. I get a sense of entitlement. But there's nothing that he does that I think, ah yes, that's perfectly in line with what I know him to be. It feels like Kubo is just trying to get cool moments with Yhwach. Like he's building up to very specific set pieces and is just trying to check boxes until he can get there. There's this weird misplacement of priorities that honestly pervades the entire final arc. The most important thing to the story doesn't seem to be the story. It seems to be very, very cool moments, and that's incredibly concerning. I mean, there's just so much stuff that happens here that doesn't build to anything, that doesn't contribute to the larger narrative. It's just here looking cool, when the actual important things are languishing in the wastes. Did we need 3 fights with Kenpachi and 2 with Mayuri while Squad Zero is being ripped to shreds in 3 chapters or less? Was it important to noodle around with Askin when Ishida is having an entire double agent arc off-screen? Was it necessary to give Nemu and Nanao intimate and textured backgrounds which, yes, were very good, but at the expense of Chad, one of the main characters, once more being written out of the story? This weird misplacement of priorities defeats the sense of urgency and intensity of Ichigo's story, and often makes the narrative stall in strange places. Kubo, you faked me out with Valkyrie's death like 5 times. That's several more than the guy whose whole gimmick is getting back up when he dies, and it was just to show me a new Bankai and a fun little quirk of a different Bankai. Also, it's dumb that Kenpachi figured out his Bankai already. I don't feel strongly about Kenpachi one way or another, but it's just weird that he's the superstar of this arc, figuring things out at turbo speed even compared to Ichigo. Why did we spend so much time developing a static side character like Kenpachi when our main crew, our Nakama, are floundering out here on the sidelines? And this is what I mean by the narrative being unfocused and sporadic. Things are just being chucked into the narrative that look very, very cool, but do nothing. It doesn't help that Kubo has introduced a lot of villains this arc. 26, in fact, and we need to deal with all of them. But due to the 3-act structure of this arc, we don't get to know them until the last act, which means we have a lot of character development that needs to happen in a very short period of time. And it's very telling that Kubo deals with this by introducing characters in batches, making them look cool, cutting away, cutting back, and then... oh, only 1 guy's left. That fight you implied that just happened, just right there, just right off screen, that sounds like it was important, but never mind. It's just the most annoying guys that stick around, overusing their gimmick and just getting on my nerves. The compelling stories and interesting characters like Bazbi and Askin are cordoned off to a few scant chapters. Meanwhile, I am suffering a brain bleed here with Valkyrie and Leal. Haschwald should have shaken me to my core. I should have been wailing in the streets about this man. Instead, he was given a tedious monologue, a slap fight with Ishida, and 1 panel to imply he had depth based on the rushed backstory of another guy ages back. I can tell Kubo really wanted to show off the cool toys he had left sitting on the shelf for years, and I get it. Bleach has a lot of spectacle, but I hope it's clear that this is actively impeding the story being told. I don't understand why he didn't set aside the interesting little what-ifs and focus on a leaner, more efficient story. We shouldn't be reintroducing side characters like Kira for no reason here. This shot's really cool. It's one of the hardest things I've ever seen in my life, and it's absolutely useless. I know I'm benefiting from hindsight, and Kubo likely didn't know that he would have to end Bleach to preserve his health, but it's just frustrating faffing around with tedious nobodies when the stories that actually matter, that actually give people weight, that actually go somewhere, aren't. They are on ice. Ichigo spends most of the last act commuting to where he needs to go. Meanwhile, we're almost making Mayuri of all people sympathetic. Inconsistency really is the name of the game in this arc, because in addition to the structural issues, Kubo is playing very fast and loose with the lore of his own canon. This section was honestly one of the most difficult to write about, because anytime you have to start proving that an author contradicts themselves, it starts to feel like you're just nitpicking. And I don't want to be pedantic here, actualing Kubo's story out of existence, but we have to acknowledge that Kubo is just not playing by the rules he himself laid out. There are some major retcons, which we will get to, but there are dozens of little inconsistencies and contradictions throughout the back half of the story, and this arc in particular. I didn't dwell on them much in the previous 2 arcs because they're small and don't really detract much from the story. Kubo is sloppy with how he handles power levels at the end of Fate Karakura Town. Ichigo is handling his Shinigami badge before having his powers restored, even though he shouldn't be able to see his badge in this current state. Little things like this. But they're pervasive in Thousand Year Blood War. They start to really affect the story and the characters in it. I dithered over how to handle this for a long time because I felt like I needed a smoking gun. Something definitive to prove, see, I'm right. But I kept coming up with little things, tiny things that really wouldn't prove much on their own but feel compellingly off. Like, does it make sense that Mayuri, of all people, would rattle off Yamamoto's rhetoric about the nobility and honor of the Gote 13 and how harming another member is worthy of death, when his character introduction was turning subordinates into living grenades against their knowledge? Or does it even make sense that this rule exists considering there was a literal open revolt 2 years earlier and not a soul mentioned this very specific, very rigid thing? No! It makes no sense at all! But it's not really enough to prove that Kubo is playing it so fast and loose with how he characterizes people and the rules of his world or the way they're implemented that it's starting to redefine the story I'm reading. Except, here's the thing. When you have enough tiny little instances of something happening, you have what we in the business like to call a trend. And that, friends, is my smoking gun. Kubo just keeps doing this over and over and over, making crap up as he goes along, not even bothering to spot check the things he slaps down on the page, and they feel wrong. Like they just fail the vibe check. It's a weird little thing that doesn't quite track with what I know, but like, it's not impossible for this to happen. But if you do this enough, everything feels suspect. I know some of you might enjoy me dissecting every tiny instance of this happening and really explaining the details of why it feels off to me, and there are also those of you who completely disagree with what I'm saying and want to see my homework. But I'm not going to do that. These things are so tiny, and it would take so much effort to cross-reference a 15-year-long story that I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Call me lazy. That's just not gonna happen with this video. I'm gonna put up a list of everything that made me squint right here, and you can decide amongst yourselves whether they're valid. You can also ask me questions in the comments. I'm perfectly happy to address them there. Meanwhile, I'm going to start tackling the really big issues. The retcons. There are a concerning number of retcons in this arc. There are many points where Kubo will introduce or explain something and it will contradict or drastically redefine what came before, and I personally think he came up with these changes after the fact. That said, I don't think it really matters at the end of the day when Kubo came up with these details. So much discussion about retcons gets bogged down in whether Kubo planned these developments all along. Like, if they can prove authorial intent, if they can timestamp something early enough, then these plot points are inoculated from criticism. Go on any forum or space dedicated to discussing Bleach, and you'll find someone ardently Pepe Sylvia-ing their way into proving that Kubo has a galaxy brain that knew 15 years worth of content ahead of time. Ichigo was actually foreshadowed as a Quincy because of his bedspread in the first chapter. Yhwach makes sense because of an ambiguous line of dialogue 400 chapters earlier.
You gotta be kidding me! I got boxes full of Pepe!
So on and so forth. I think these are a bit ridiculous and just demonstrably untrue, but proving the veracity of these claims isn't the issue. The issue, or at least my issue, isn't when Kubo came up with these ideas. It's how he implemented them into the story, and whether he respected pre-existing canon. I do not like these retcons because I think they weaken what came before. I think they tear the story down. I think they so drastically overwrite canon that it invalidates the emotional journeys that I've gone on. If Kubo pulled out a time capsule and proved to me that, look, he planned all of the things that I'm about to talk about 10 years ago and has cleverly been waiting to implement them all this time, I still would not like them. I would think that Kubo misled me into trusting one thing when he specifically, deliberately meant something else, just so he could have a gotcha moment years down the line. More than that, the plot twists change the meaning of canon, often in frustrating, nonsensical, unnecessary ways. It's not that Kubo doesn't justify these elements. He's not hurling spaghetti at the wall and gleefully running with whatever sounds vaguely reasonable. There is effort being put in. But if you dig even a little bit deeper than the surface, things stop making sense. The connective tissue isn't there, the character rationale is patchy, and it feels like most of the in-world justification for why we weren't told things right away is because people are just lying, and that's incredibly troubling to me. I don't want to learn in the 11th hour that my foundational knowledge for this series is all lies. That just means I can't trust you going forward, and that is an incredibly terrible place to be. The frustrating thing is that the devil truly is in the details, and I think even some of the most egregious retcons I'm about to discuss would be fine if Kubo had tweaked just a couple of things, but also give a very, very good reason why we were never told the truth in the first place. So we've got 3 big instances that I want to focus on, partly for brevity's sake, and partly because I think these are the ones that most critically impact the story. 1. Hollows are poison to Quincy. This is a neat idea. It's a very cool solution to the Quincy stealing Bankai, and I loved how this was delivered. Again, Kubo did put in the effort to rationalize why this would work. When I read this part, I get the very cool brain blast moment as it all slots together. Except, this is negatively impacting the narrative on multiple levels, and I will have all of my arguments right here because they are very prescient to my greater criticisms of the 1,000-Year Blood War, but it's a bit of a tangent. It doesn't really fit anywhere else, so I'm just gonna nuzzle it in here, and then move on to the actual criticisms of a retcon. This is a great way to start the section. Chaos. Chaos. Can you tell this video essay was built on chaos? If Kubo had always planned that hollows were poison to Quincy, or if at least he came up with it more than a few seconds before he had to say it out loud, why do we never see that being the case with Ishida? Hey, this is editing me, popping in real quick to tell you that I wrote this script literally months ago, and I just barely managed to finish all of the audio today. You know what else happened today? I read an article where Kubo addresses this exact plot hole and says that Ishida is just a special little Quincy boy, and strongly implies it's because his bloodline diverged from the rest of the Quincy, even though that's not really how the manga established things to have worked. Now, I just want to say, I'm being Betty here. I'm mad that this invalidates an entire part of my essay, small though it is. I'm even more concerned because it sounds like a band-aid that'll be slapped on top of this entire issue, where people say, "Oh, you just didn't understand Bleach well enough. Kubo addressed this whole thing," even though it doesn't really address my deeper issue. Now, I think this is a retcon because he didn't address this in the months and months that happened between Urahara introducing the idea of hollows being poison to Quincy and the series ending. And it feels even more like a retcon because, to my knowledge, this idea has never been addressed in the roughly 8 years since the story ended, making it sound like this was a solution that Kubo came up with in the interim when people started pointing out what an obvious plot hole this was. So, I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page to make clear that I'm not mad that hollows are poison to Quincy. I'm mad that it's so poorly integrated into the entire series and I have all these very obvious, straightforward, logical holes that back me up. And any time the series tries to patch over those holes and make the story make more sense, it just makes things worse and fails to actually deal with the problem. Okay, I just wanted to clear that up real quick. Let's get back to the essay. I sound like I'm happy and condescending because I'm actually furious and this whole project is cursed! Ah! He's been injured by hollows and he shows no particular adverse effects. Even when he loses his powers, even when he's cheek to cheek with hollows, even when he is shrouded in a hollow Reiatsu so dense it is like an ocean above the sky, there aren't any particular adverse effects. In fact, none of the Quincy seem to be overly affected by hollow energy, regardless of where they are or who they face, except for when Kubo needs this poisoned by the very existence of hollows things to be plot relevant. If the answer is that all of the Sternritter are strong enough that it doesn't matter, that's not really poison, is it? It is just a contrivance to undo the plot you just made, which is starting to become a pattern. Also, while Urahara sweeping in with this neato solution feels like a clever development on his part, it has the terrible consequence of reminding us that, hey, you have Vizards! They have hollow powers. They should probably be the secret weapon of this entire arc. In fact, all of the hollow derivations should be absolute power players here. You would think this would be a great in for the people with hollow-adjacent powers you introduced in arc earlier, instead of relegating them to the sidelines. You would think this would be an absolute layup for the captain-level Shinigami with hollow powers that do nothing except get dunked on for an entire arc. You would think this would be a walk in the park for the actual hollows. I am honestly frothing at the mouth at how much disrespect is shown to some of my favorite crews here, but especially for the Vizards. They did not go on that whole outcast exile journey just to be chucked out with the dishwater here. Not only do they contribute nothing to the overall arc, but we only see them use their powers once and to absolutely no effect. Kubo confirmed in a Q&A that the reason Ichigo's Bankai couldn't be stolen was because he was part hollow. So that says to me, the moment Shinji, Rose, and Kensei hear that news, they would be sprinting to the heaviest hitters to poison them with their mere presence. We should be seeing them Bankai all over the place. It's also mighty convenient that roughly a fourth of the captains happen to lose their Bankai, and yet it never overlaps with the fourth that cannot have their Bankai stolen. I know it would undercut Urahara's reveal if, oops, Shinji's Bankai just couldn't be yoinked or something, but it would also make the story stronger for accounting for this very obvious flaw. It would also give Shinji something to do instead of running around herding sheep for the entire third act, but that's a problem for the anime to fix. Plus, this development makes it even more ridiculous that Ichigo never hollowifies post-reset, and especially post The Blade Is Me, because he should be in full control now, so he shouldn't be worried about hollowifying. But I think the intimation is that he can't hollowify because it was burned out of him when he lost his powers, but also Ichigo says later that he still has hollow energy burned into his soul, presumably because of his hollowification, or maybe because of Masaki and the whole fullbring thing. So he can do it. He can hollowify. He just isn't. All of the masked army are simply choosing not to be the masked army when faced with the most opportune moment to be the masked army, except for these four idiots who are so shamefully underpowered that even acknowledging this confrontation is just disrespectful. My genuine worst fear in this entire situation is that the reason we don't see the Vizard captains hollowify is because they were de-hollowified once they rejoined the Gotei 13, because that is the only feasible explanation I can come up with. But if that is even possible, I cannot articulate how miserable and devastating that lack of consequences for such a vital part of the series would be. So I'm going to pretend I never had that thought. Instead, we're going to talk about how the Arrancar disappoint me in this arc. It is super dumb that Urahara went to Hueco learned that hollows are poison to Quincy, brought two of them back, had them sit on their thumbs until they have the most unproductive fight that leads us nowhere. We should be torpedoing Grimmjow at everyone's face. He should be using his kitty claws to cut a swath through the Sternritter. Nell should be doing literally anything other than sitting just off camera and waiting for her cue. They are poison to Quincy! Instead, they just futz around with one random guy for a while and then maybe die off screen. I spent 5 years thinking they died off screen because Kubo leaves this story on an ambiguous ending because I didn't read a light novel. Why are all of the answers in a light novel? The idea that hollows are poison to Quincy is very cool, very much not justified by the narrative, and only serves to undo a development that Kubo came up with just a few weeks earlier. I would have liked to have seen this fleshed out. I would have liked it to be acknowledged beyond a quick plot fix. I think it's a very intriguing idea, but mostly, it just makes me grumpy for my hollow gang. 2. Isshin's backstory. Isshin being a Shiba is cool. It's fun, it just feels right on so many levels. And yet, it's kind of absolute nonsense. This development doesn't impact the plot as intensely as the previous point, but it does fundamentally change all of the characters involved, making all of them far more stupid or cruel than I initially thought them to be. Very simply, most of the officers of the Gote 13 would not only be aware of the captain that disappeared one day, but also would be able to calculate that, he was gone just long enough to have a bullheaded teenage son that also has Shinigami powers. Like, are you kidding me? Byakuya would have pounced on that in a heartbeat. If he could have shifted Rukia's culpability for giving her powers to a rando onto the son of a rogue captain, he absolutely would have done that. His entire interaction wouldn't be, you're a disgusting outsider human disgracing our traditions. It would be, you're the son of a dirty, rotten traitor, and I am honor-bound to purge you from the face of the earth. He never would have let this go. He would have been saying it over and over and over, and yet we get crickets. Plus, several people remark that Ichigo bears a striking resemblance to Kaien. Specifically Kaien. Only Kaien. No one else but Kaien. Like, Ichigo has such an uncanny resemblance to one of the Shibas. You think they would say, oh yeah, that makes sense because your dad's a Shiba and he just disappeared and went to the world of the living and then had you. If it is so obvious that people don't feel the need to remark on it, it is something the audience should know. There's no reason for clever boots like Shunsui or Ukitake not to remark on that in their private conversations with people, being like, yeah, this absolutely makes sense. That's exactly the family's MO. Shibas sure do be Shiba-ing. He even went to his Shiba relatives to break in. You know who would be even more likely to remark on these things? Hitsugai Matsumoto. If Rukia could take one look at Ichigo and be like, oh snap, you're like this guy that I worked with very closely. You know that would happen to Hitsugaya and Matsumoto, looking at Isshin's son, sitting in Isshin's house, likely feeling Isshin's freshly unlocked Reiatsu. I'm losing my dadgum mind. Like, I'm pretty sure Matsumoto saw him in Fake Karakura Town. Everyone would have seen Isshin in Fake Karakura Town. They certainly would have felt him fighting Aizen, and yet not a one of them remarked on this in the slightest, and I am losing my mind. If they couldn't make this connection, they're idiots. If this is open knowledge and they never found it worth gossiping about, they are not the characters I know. And if they did figure it out after the fact, but deliberately decided not to tell Ichigo, then that is a level of maliciousness or negligence I cannot stomach. Yet again, it would mean everyone is hiding things from and lying to him for no understandable reason. It sucks, it's pointless, it's dumb, and it's cruel. Again, this is just down to the details. Maybe Isshin could have bounced, say, a decade before Ichigo was born, rather than a few years. Maybe Isshin could have been banished instead of just deciding not to come into work one day and everyone shrugging to themselves before promoting the literal child. Maybe if there was just a good reason why no one from the Soul Society acknowledged him. If there was literally anything other than a few plot contrivances to justify why Isshin is also caught up in the Aizen mess in the most tortured way possible, I would probably be okay. But it isn't. It's just a slapped together thing because, hey, wouldn't it be fun if Isshin was a Shiba and worked with these two random people? This development frustrates me because it doesn't feel like Kubo wanted to tell the further complicated story of the Shibas and why it's so thematically poignant that they are still raging against the twisted machine of the Soul Society. It just feels like he wanted to tie Isshin back into this convoluted story, and it would be kind of neat if he was part of this family, and hey, he already said Ichigo looks like Kaien. The rest of Isshin's backstory is mostly okay. The characterization itself is consistent and fun, and there's something noble about a man in his prime throwing away his prestigious life just to save one person. I like the arc of his romance with Misaki, brief though it is, because it's just wholesome and sweet, and it's just nice after the meat grinder of the invasion of the Soul Society. Theirs is a relationship not of angst, but of pure joy and respect and a delight in the act of living. And I especially like the idea that of everything Isshin knew, everything he could have become in the world of the living, he decided to put down his sword and be a doctor instead. Isshin Kurosaki is an immensely complicated dude with an even more complicated relationship with his son, But there's something beautiful about being able to always trust him to be a protective pillar in times of need. This next point straddles the line between this retcon and the previous one, but I figure we finally have enough context for me to talk through the wonky lore logic of Isshin and Masaki canceling each other out, and how Kubo most likely came up with all of that as justification for keeping Isshin in the human world on the fly. Hollows, Quincy, then there's Shinigami, then humans. And Urahara tells us that these two are opposites. That is the whole point of the 1,000-Year Blood War. And then these two are opposites. So, when Masaki gets got, she then needs Isshin to become a human in his special Gigai, and that balances her out. And that prevents the soul suicide. And everything is good and balanced and equal. Here's the problem with that. Hollows and Shinigami are thematic opposites. That's the entire point of the first half of the story. So when you have the Ardenkar evolving out of Hollows, they are becoming like Shinigami. They are removing their masks. They are becoming their opposite to become more powerful. Then you also see that with Vizards. They evolve out of Shinigami. They undergo hollowification and become more powerful. And these two are identified by Ichigo, Shinji, Aizen, Kaname, and Gin as being the same sort of deal. That is the entire point of the entire first part. It's these people interacting. Now, you'd think that in the pursuit of balance, these two, they'd balance out. They absolutely do not. Instead, you have Quincy evolving out of humans, but you never really get people talking about that beyond their introduction because Quincy are anomalies. They are strange. They are outliers. You see these three groups interacting a whole heck ton throughout the story. Humans either becoming Shinigami if they have spiritual powers when they die, or decaying into hollows. And then of course, these two fighting about it. These three are interacting because the Quincy throw the whole thing out of balance. That is the entire reason they are purged. It gets worse. Then you have fullbringers, which are humans that then have hollow powers because their mothers were attacked by hollows. It's weird, it's powerful, it's a whole thing. Substitute Shinigami come in, with them being humans that are given Shinigami powers. We are told by Ginjo that these two are opposites, and he says so with authorial intent. So it is again Shinigami opposing the hollows as tempered by humans. These two are interacting because they are opposites. It gets worse. You have an Ardenkar Quincy. He is the first Quincy that we interact with in the 1,000-Year Blood War. He is these two. He should not exist because you'd think he'd be undergoing the soul suicide the entire time he's on screen. Quincy don't have antibodies to hollows, so you would think that their powers cannot be transferred over to a hollow, but instead he persists. And then, here, you'd think Ichigo, as the child of a Quincy and a Shinigami, would be his opposite, since Ibern is a hollow and a Quincy. That's what happened here, that's what happens here. But no, that doesn't happen. They don't interact thematically. He is a weird red herring. These two are not meant to be associated. Instead, you have Ichigo, who is presented in the story as this amazing balance. Hollows, Quincy, Shinigami, and humans. And that is great, and that is excellent. But then you remember, oops, he's also this, and he's also this, and he's also this, but he's definitely not this. Don't think about it. Don't do it. And then Kubo says that is exactly how he wants the story to work. 3. Old Man Zangetsu is the manifestation of Ichigo's Quincy power. Oh, if I didn't make people mad before, I'm definitely gonna do so now. This one is difficult to explain because it's wrapped up in a lot of emotion for me. I think there's a logical, reasonable explanation for why this sequence of chapters makes me so irrationally angry, but trying to engage with this plot beat at all gets me heated. I'm honestly trying not to get angry about it right now. There have been a lot of attempts and breaks and rewrites for this section to make it more than just an incoherent vent session. I hate that Old Man Zangetsu is supposedly Yhwach from 1,000 years ago, planted in Ichigo's soul. It is an effective twist. It hits me on an emotional level, clearly, and the idea has enough of a foundation that I can understand and even respect that other people find this compelling. I don't think you're dumb or bad if you like this, just because I don't. But to me, this development doesn't feel like an exciting surprise. It feels like a betrayal. Before we get into it, I will acknowledge that I don't really get the core of what The Blade Is Me is trying to say. I've read it about 6 different times, I've read the wiki summary, I've read and watched varying analyses on it, I have tried to engage with this development on its own terms. But the core concepts and flow of logic just does not land. I do not want you to explain it to me. Do not explain it to me. I am not receiving knowledge about The Blade Is Me today. I think what's trying to be conveyed is that when this conversation is done, Ichigo and Zangetsu are perfectly aligned in intention and will. They are one, heart, body, mind, and spirit, so Ichigo will stop identifying Zangetsu as an entity separate from him. The Blade is me. This particular character arc appears to make sense and is well paced throughout the story. Ichigo learns that Zangetsu exists, trains to perform Bankai, forms a tentative truce with Shirosaki by dominating his will, has another little chat with the two of them and learns Mugetsu, the final secret of his Zanpakuto, finally discovers the real truth of the Quincy spirit, formerly known as Zangetsu, and then recognizes that he and Zangetsu, and also that Quincy thing, are one. And this handily ties into the other inner world segments of the story, as The Blade Is Me engages with the idea that Ichigo was too afraid to recognize the truth about Zangetsu, that he knew all along that something wasn't right, he just didn't want to look at it. And because he was running from this, he couldn't embrace Zangetsu as a piece of himself, so on and so forth. It's a character flaw of Ichigo's, a tacit refusal of the call and a roadblock of his own making. Overcoming this is vital in an arc that is all about coming to terms with his identity, and sounds like a good arc. Except, everything leading up to this point has said that Ichigo's real roadblock is constantly being lied to by the people he trusts so that he can't understand the state of his powers. I cannot accept The Blade Is Me because the core premise does not make sense, because it is actively refusing to recognize the story that came before, much less the things said in these very chapters. The Blade Is Me hinges on the idea that Ichigo is an active agent, that his choices and beliefs are the most important in this scenario. But this is directly contradicted by having multiple people secretly exerting control over Ichigo by keeping information from him. Isshin just had an entire flashback about how he willfully chose to lie to Ichigo about every aspect of his existence until the literal world depended on him knowing, and he did it twice. Zangetsu just monologued about how he intentionally obstructed Ichigo's growth because he decided on his own that Ichigo's goals and ideology were inherently bad as he progressed down the path of the Shinigami. Not because of what Ichigo actually did, mind, but because, and I cannot stress how this is left only as subtext and supposition, Zangetsu is an offshoot of Yhwach's soul and is therefore so blinded by Yhwach's anti-Shinigami bias that he never bothered to get to know Ichigo as a person and simply assumed the worst. This is not Ichigo's failure. This is Ichigo being failed by others. He thought he had done everything that was asked of him. He sought knowledge from Zangetsu and believed everything he was told. And sure, it's possible for Ichigo to do all of these things and have doubts, but that is simply not the story we were told. The first time we are introduced to the idea of Ichigo having doubts about Zangetsu is the moment he says, "Yeah, I've been having doubts about Zangetsu," which is literally the example of show don't tell. Compare this with the 2 times Ichigo angsts about succumbing to Shirosaki, where we see him hesitating, doubting himself, being racked with turmoil. It is affecting the way he thinks about things, it's affecting the way he interacts with things. We know what it looks like when Ichigo has doubts, and yet this, the justification for one of the biggest twists in the series, is never expressed or acknowledged to the reader before the exact second it is relevant. Furthermore, it just feels offensive that we are yet again thrust into Ichigo's inner world, only to be lectured about how he hasn't done enough after we were sure he had attained mastery over his blade. He became the literal physical manifestation of it. Why wouldn't Ichigo think he and his blade are already one? Why wouldn't he have thought that he had attained true mastery, that he had accepted every facet of his blade possible? What was the point of this fight then? What is the premise of Mugetsu, if not unveiling every secret his Zanpakuto has? For the blade is me to be true, it has to invalidate the entirety of Mugetsu, which is just spitting in my face, because it means Ichigo made the biggest sacrifice of his entire life and was lied to every second of the way. And yet, facing this supposed ignorance is framed as Ichigo coming to terms with himself, accepting his own flaws, turning with courage to face the scary parts of himself. Which is just kind of annoying. This entire scenario is just a far shallower, less involved version of what has already happened with his hollow powers. And even that wasn't resolved adequately because all of the footwork, say it with me, either happened off screen in the 3 months he fought Zangetsu and the Dangai, or didn't happen at all. And even then, treating Ichigo's Quincy powers as an obstacle to overcome does not make sense, because Ichigo has never viewed the Quincy as a bad thing to be. At no point have I ever thought it is a struggle for Ichigo to accept the Quincy, much less being part Quincy. Ichigo is obviously far more concerned about the people that keep lying to him. Moreover, even if this were, by some strain of logic, Ichigo's problem to fix, this would be an incredibly flat way to do it. What does Ichigo do in The Blade Is Me? He stands there and listens passively as his not-quite-Zanpakuto monologues about all of the half-truths and misdirections he gave Ichigo, doesn't apologize, and then dissolves into dust like that fixes anything. Then Ichigo's third eye opens, and he's great actually, much better for it. I would go through all of this suffering again because it made me strong. We aren't even given the luxury of speaking to Shirasaki, the actual Zanpakuto spirit that has been dragged along in Zangetsu's undertow. You know, Shirasaki, the one that has apparently been helping this conspiracy the entire time. Shirasaki, the one that has been treated as a nascent, chaotic entity within Ichigo's soul that must literally be torn out of Ichigo if they want to speak. Shirasaki, the one that has been stripped of all identity to the extent of repeatedly announcing that he has no name, and when he later identifies himself as Zangetsu, it's presented as an intentionally confusing, frustrating half-truth as he's very intensely suggested to be a new, rogue offshoot that grew from Ichigo's hollification. Shirasaki, the one that happily let himself be suppressed as Zangetsu wrested control of Ichigo's inner world, passively letting himself be shunted aside in favor of Zangetsu's more dubious, ostensibly counterproductive goals. Shirasaki, the one that apparently came up with a bunch of lies about why Ichigo kept losing control of himself back in the Arrancar and Hueco Mundo arcs that are not only incredibly elaborate, but also make more sense than Ichigo just being blasted with a bunch of Shinigami energy. Shirasaki, the one that appears as nothing more than a cameo in this arc. Shirasaki, the one that threatened to crush Ichigo's skull if he ever deemed Ichigo unworthy of wielding him. That's the guy we somehow have no need to speak with and understand, because Zangetsu's too busy monologuing about what a terrible person he's been to Ichigo from the very moment they met. All this conversation does is blame Ichigo for the actions of others and destroy the beautiful arc of growth, understanding, cooperation, and self-actualization I thought had actually occurred. I thought this was about Ichigo seeing through the lesser impulses of fear, pain, and rage. I thought this was about mastering the dark aspects of your soul and keeping hold of yourself in the chaos. I thought this was about sacrificing your own wants and desires for the sake of serving, of protecting others. But no. In reality, it's just being jerked around and then arbitrarily being given the truth and power you sought because the people screwing you over completed their acceptance arcs just off screen and decided to be honest for once in their lives. I know I made an extended argument earlier about how Ichigo should have completed his arc by the beginning of the 1,000-Year Blood War, but I don't think that's the only way to have told this story. If you were to pitch me the idea of Ichigo coming to accept himself with no reservations or doubts, of unifying his purpose so completely that he and the disparate fragments of his soul become one, I would probably love it. I want to see that journey he goes on. I want to see him be an active and knowing participant in the solution. But the way it happens here does actual violence on the story and characters involved, and is yet another example of Kubo telling us something happened, but it never mattering from here on. The new zangetsu doesn't help him, the new understanding doesn't empower him, he never subconsciously uses Quincy techniques again, his new Bankai is less pretty, his new powers are seemingly an ineffective waste of time, and despite all of this talk about finding the true form of zangetsu, we are definitively told at the end of this series that the true zangetsu is the one Ichigo was using all along. Yet again, we have invalidated this entire digression by merely returning to the status quo. The blade is me? No. The blade is a couple of liars that have invalidated every level of our relationship for convoluted, unproductive, and entirely dubious reasons. You'll forgive me if I'm critical of this section. My choices are either being lied to for 6 years, or being told that one of the most beautiful arcs and themes of this entire story was worth less than a shocking twist that doesn't make sense and never pays off at all. The 1,000-Year Blood War arc is very, very complicated to talk about. It's vast, it's nuanced, it's scattered, it's self-indulgent, it's trying to tie off one of the biggest manga stories in the world. I can't and won't dismiss it out of hand because I will not deny the impressive, impactful, important things that Kubo is doing here. But it has a lot more fundamental issues than the rest of the series, and worst yet, they reach back and mess with the story that has already come before, weakening the narrative seemingly for just a few shocks and some hasty plot justification. I was left cold by the end of this arc, where Ichigo defeats Yhwach. I said this earlier, but I cannot stress how much stronger the narrative would have been if it concluded several chapters earlier. This is the declaration that defines Ichigo's being. This is the moment of emotional catharsis. This is the moment that put tears in my eyes. Of course Ichigo has experienced despair. He's been through it so many times, and yet he has overcome it time and time again. But Bleach doesn't end here. It ends several chapters later, awkwardly stumbling to its finish. I was tired by this point. I was sick of the conflicts being dragged out. I was let down by the absence of all the people that I thought should be here. I was desperately trying to understand what this victory meant. Why this, Kubo? Why are you telling the story like this? Why is this the moment everything works and not the 4 previous attempts? What did this story tell us? What was the purpose of everything? Did things shake out like this because you needed to end the story, so you wrote in a hasty resolution? I'm not going to be mad if the answer is yes. I just need to understand why the ending of one of my favorite stories falls so flat. Everything I thought was true was rewritten time and time again, and it just feels meaningless. It feels unfair. It feels like I'm ready for it to end. I have struggled a lot with how to conclude this essay. There is such a keen sense of ambivalence when I think about this story, because there are things I deeply disagree with and feel disappointed by. There are also things that give me such a sense of wonder and delight, and to ignore either in favor of a simpler, more unified statement is dishonest. The second half of Bleach is messy, well-intentioned, short on time, squandering its true potential, filled with compelling premises, and clearly trying to swallow more than it can chew. That is all as true the first time I read it as the second and third. But I didn't set out on this project to determine if Bleach was good or bad. I already gave you my thoughts at the beginning of the video. I did this to better understand it. Even the parts I dislike, even the parts I think could have been done better, even the parts that make me angry. I want to understand Bleach and the things it's trying to say and how it says them. I want to understand how and why it makes me feel the way I feel. And while I would hardly say I'm done with that journey, I can in good faith say I know where I stand. At the end of the 1,000-Year Blood War, there is an epilogue chapter. I'd given up on Bleach a couple years previously, and on a whim I decided to go back and read everything that I'd missed, see where it ended, all in one go. Predictably, it was late when I finished it, maybe 2 in the morning, and I was exhausted from marathoning the last 100 or so chapters. And after reading those very difficult final 20 chapters, it wasn't enough to hear that they had their happily ever after. I wanted answers. Real ones this time, substantive ones, and not just rewrites to questions I didn't think I had to ask. I wanted the resolution to problems I had been dealing with for years, closure on characters I wasn't even sure had survived. It all felt too fast, too short, and seeing these characters bop along just fine, resuming normal lives after such heartache, was frustrating. The chapter itself is fine, it's cotton candy, but after everything I'd been through, I didn't want cotton candy. I wanted to know that everything I had been through mattered. But reading this chapter again, it hit me different. Maybe it's because I'm 7 years older than I was. Maybe it's because I didn't marathon the ending of Bleach and miserably finish in the middle of the night. Maybe it's because I've had plenty of time to consider this story as a whole, find the supplemental content, read the companion one-shot, get some context for things that I was left hanging on. Yeah, it didn't give me the closure I so desperately craved. Yeah, the things I wanted to see were neglected. Yeah, all of the criticisms I had going into the second half of the story still stand, and this is still cotton candy and doesn't fix any of it. But seeing these characters come together and be just fine, being able to resume normal lives after such heartache, it's a really beautiful thing. They know despair, and they have been through it so many times, and they have overcome it time and time again. They have faced the odds, they have questioned their beliefs, they have confronted their family and friends and themselves, and they have experienced horrors that no one should have to. And yet here they are, 6 hearts beating as one. Final verdict? I recognize your flaws, and I love you anyway out of 10. I hope you guys can love it too. Take care.